Neural Seduction, Virtual Reality, Evolution and Meditation, written by David Christopher Lane, narrated by Jason Zenobia. The future is virtual, and the virtual is now. One of the greatest benefits I have received in teaching college these past 35 years is that students tend to be more current with what is the latest trend, for better or worse, in technology. For example, I got chided the other day by a bright student for comments I had made earlier in the year on the most popular of cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin. I don't exactly recall what I said, but I emphasized being cautious about investing in such things, as they are extremely volatile. I remember too well the tech bubble of the late 1990s and how many stock speculators ended up losing millions of dollars. The student then explained that she had bought Bitcoin at $3,000 despite my skeptical comments, and that it was now priced at $14,000 plus. See, Professor Lane, how wrong you were? I complimented her on making such a fast return on her investment, but again emphasized that she should expect ups and downs and to be careful with her earnings. Yet the student's larger point was that I was mistaken in my earlier doubts about Bitcoin and that she was happy she took the risk. I too was happy for my student's fourfold windfall, but I was much more pleased that she had learned an important lesson. Professors can always be potentially wrong, and students should never abdicate their own critical faculties to authority figures. Of course, it may well be that Bitcoin may sink from its current heights or rise much higher, but the greater point is to think for one's self and take responsibility for the choices we make and to weigh out the pros and cons about the information we receive. When I used to teach an upper division class entitled Science and Religion at California State University, Long Beach, I summarized in one sentence the key to critical thinking: the ability to admit to being wrong. As Karl Popper realized early on when comparing the theories of Marx and Freud with those of Albert Einstein, science should always have a no-escape hatch whereby one's hypothesis lives and dies on evidence, and not merely posturing beliefs, which can accommodate almost any sort of disconfirmation. In sum, Einstein's theory of relativity is scientific precisely because it can be falsified. It can be shown to be wrong, whereas with much of Marxist and Freudian theory, nothing gets refuted per se, but rather ideologically spun away or justified. I bring this up as a preface, since being potentially wrong is why I find Jaron Lanier's three latest books, You Are Not a Gadget, Who Owns the Future, and his latest The Dawn of the New Everything on the Cyber Landscape, to be so refreshing. Jaron Lanier is famous for creating the breakthrough video game Moondust in the early 1980s, which was designed for the Commodore 64 computer and which generated a lot of buzz in Silicon Valley for its artistic and musical overlay. He is also known for being one of the early pioneers of virtual reality, co-founding VPL Research in the 1980s. Although Lanier still works on VR as an interdisciplinary scientist at Microsoft, he is becoming increasingly well known as an acerbic critic of digital utopianism. He is particularly critical of Kurzweilian hype over the future singularity, and most pointedly on the addictive qualities inherent in social networks such as Facebook. He clearly saw how corrupting and disorienting the web would become if humans were allowed to be anonymous players who didn't face the consequences of their words or actions online. One of his most profound insights is how social networks tend to devolve into us versus them clan behavior, which lead almost invariably to increased polarization across a whole spectrum of associated interests, ranging from religion to politics to economics to ethnic relations. As Lanier lamented in his recent interview for The Verge, empathy can be turned to terrible ends because people behave like jerks when they turn into tribes or packs. The problem with the online world today is that to maximize engagement, you need to maximize emotional engagement, and the emotions that are most engaging are the negative ones. I think a lot of people perceive a sort of arc of improving empathy and ethics in civilization. Recently, it's been reversed. The Arab Spring turned into this terrible wave of terrorist nihilism. When women got together to try and improve their lot in the gaming world, it turned into Gamergate, which turned into the alt-right. Black Lives Matter preceded this normalization of racism and white supremacy that was just unthinkable a year before. All of these movements that are so social media-centric provide the fuel to the social media system. But to maximize the value of that fuel, it's routed into negative purposes, so the people who are the most irritated by whatever is going on that's positive are introduced to each other. The backlash is vastly more powerful than the initial attempt. My prediction is that Me Too will create some kind of horrible social event through social media in about a year. Yet, despite his contrarian credentials, he is a strong advocate of virtual reality and what it could do for human well-being, especially in developing deeper personal interactions in a whole host of imagined environments. 25 years ago, when virtual reality was first becoming widely publicized, I didn't think much of its potential, even though I did enjoy the futuristic graphics in the 1992 movie The Lawnmower Man, despite the fact that the plot was mostly Hollywood drivel. My pessimistic view of VR changed several years ago when I tried Google Cardboard, Oculus Rift, and other headsets. As I wrote in 2015 in the article The Avatar Project, I felt like Saint Paul on the way to Damascus. I was shocked as I was teleported to another realm. Even though I knew Google Cardboard, which uses your smartphone as its fundamental hardware, was still a very primitive device, I immediately realized that the future I dreamt about decades ago had arrived, and that it was only going to get better. Much better. My optimism about all things VR has only increased in the past couple of years. One of the chief reasons for this change in my attitude is seeing the potential of VR and what it could do for education, medicine, sports, and entertainment. Being able to virtually simulate a task before actually doing it is transformative, as anyone who has done VR surgery or aviation can readily attest. Yet, what has really drawn me into the future potential of all things virtual is watching my oldest son, Sean, become adept at playing a variety of VR interactive games, such as Echo Arena and Unspoken. Sean has gotten so good, in fact, that just 6 months ago, he won an all-expense-paid trip to New York City to compete in the first-ever Oculus Rift Unspoken tournament, sponsored by Microsoft Stores. Out of a field of nearly 1,000 competitors nationwide, Sean secured 4th place and a nice tidy cash prize. This motivated him even further, and he practiced for months to win a trip to Oakland, California to compete in the North American Championships, where he made the finals and won 3rd place, winning $1,500. This, plus earning almost $50 each week for online competitions, meant that he was more or less a professional cyber athlete in the newly emerging field of e-sports, where competitors worldwide play interactive video games such as Counter-Strike and PUBG for increasingly large sums of money. Before watching my son, Sean, play, I never even knew that such endeavors were so popular. I'm told that Poland is home to the biggest e-sport happening on Earth, where each year gamers from around the globe compete for hundreds of thousands of dollars. In the city of Katowice, Poland, nearly 200,000 fans descend on the vast Spodek arena to watch players battle it out on League of Legends, StarCraft 2, and other events. I wouldn't have believed the wild enthusiasm for e-sports unless I witnessed it myself, as I did several weeks ago at the Oracle Arena in Oakland. The crowd watching their respective stars in Counter-Strike and PUBG was massive, and I had to plug my ears on more than one occasion because the roar and cheering was so loud as to be almost unbelievable. E-sports fans seem even more enthusiastic for their teams than those who watch regular sporting events such as football or baseball. I mention all this because the new wave of competitive gaming is taking place within virtual reality, which has the potential to utterly transform sports as we know it, and not only for the competitors, but for those watching. It is now possible to don a VR headset and actually be fully immersed on the court with the players themselves, even having the ghostly ability of passing right through them and not interfere with their play. Imagine, if you will, watching an NBA game with LeBron James of the Cleveland Cavaliers, now Los Angeles Lakers, driving for the hoop as you pretend to guard him, again having no real physical impact, as he passes right through your avataric body while slam-dunking the ball. You are right in the heart of the action and can witness things like never before, feeling a deeper sense of involvement that was previously unimaginable. VR sports is just the tip of a computational iceberg. In VR, the opportunities are almost limitless. But herein lies a great danger, since VR also has the potential for a very dark side. Jaron Lanier is well aware of this, and he appeared flummoxed this past week in London when asked about how criminals and sociopaths could manipulate virtual reality for nefarious purposes. Lanier readily admits such could be the case, and he warned that we will have to be vigilant in making sure that VR is used positively. We shouldn't be naive about this either. I remember the innocent days of the early internet, which was mostly used by those with educational affiliations, where spam was exceptionally rare and commerce was mostly non-existent. After the development of the World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee in 1989 and the evolution of browsers to better access data, from Mosaic to Netscape, etc., the floodgates opened up and the net was taken over by all sorts of questionable elements. Statistically speaking, it is estimated that over 50% of all email today is junk, even reaching as high as 71% in May of 2014. We are quite literally swamped in an informational sea of spam. VR too is not immune from this same type of data infection, though most likely it will take on novel iterations. Lanier has long bemoaned what has happened to the internet, which has become more and more dominated by 5 extraordinarily large companies: Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon. We are moment to moment leaking out the most intimate details of our lives to massive cloud servers which are beyond our control, and which, in turn, use that very information to shape, in a Skinnerian fashion, our behavior. We are data rats in a digital maze, and we sometimes remain oblivious to how we are being manipulated by present algorithms designed to make us click this or that button, whether for likes or for products we feel compelled to buy on a whim. Lanier's warning shot across the bow is that with VR, since it is still in its infancy, we have a chance to harmonize our digital worlds with our humanity. For Lanier, VR is all about human interaction, but in order for that to happen, we need to look back at what we haven't achieved with the internet. As Lanier explains, in the 90s, I was the chief scientist of this consortium called Internet 2, trying to figure out how to make the Internet scalable, and we thought we were doing the best possible thing for the world. And I just wonder, what did we achieve with all this work? All of these lives that were devoted to this thing, and it sometimes seems to be tearing the world apart. We might have to start over. It might really be that bad. But I really hope not. I really think that if we can just change the financial incentives so that somebody like Facebook is making money from helping people do creative and wonderful, valuable things, rather than from being paid to manipulate them by third parties, it might correct itself. I think there's still hope for that. Yes, it would be great if we could refashion the Internet with a built-in micro-payment system and give individuals more control over their digital destiny, including our varied privacy concerns. I fear that it may be too late for such a cyber metanoia, but with VR we still have a chance, since it is a technology that is ultimately all about presence and being acutely conscious of one's surroundings and those who enter into the same region, even if enveloped in different avataric forms. As Takashi Torisu elaborates, presence is crucial to participants feel sense of being in a virtual environment. Enhancing presence as a psychological phenomenon can offer participants a special subjective experience rather than the purely observational experience like that of television or film. Presence is composed of 3 dimensions. 1. Social presence relates to the sense of being there. 2. Personal presence connects to feeling of being there with others. And 3. Environmental presence presents the existence of virtual space. Ironic as this may sound, VR is all about being attentive to the present moment and the environment that is surrounding you. I have long noticed that VR and meditation have similarities, since both only come to fruition when one is fully attentive. Last night, for instance, I was using Oculus Rift and found myself standing on the moon, looking at the vast expanse of the cosmos. Even though I had a headset on, it seemed like I was looking out for thousands of miles. It was so mesmerizing that I felt as if I was undergoing a momentary satori, all of which was being triggered by a magical device designed to trick my brain into believing it was actually there. Mikey Siegel, a pioneer in using the latest gadgetry to track us back to our core selves, raises a most interesting and pregnant query. Can we imagine the devices on our desks, in our pockets, and on our wrists actually helping us right now, in this moment, to bring us back to this experience and to help facilitate the deepest, most profound experience of life? Well, I know that in VR that such a possibility not only exists in the future, but exists right now. Yes, all sorts of games and applications are also available as well, but in each case, VR demands your attention, and that is why it is fundamentally different than most other technological innovations. And yet, Jaron Lanier's sadness about what has happened to the Internet makes me pause and think that VR could also go down the rabbit hole and turn that which is positive upside down. As Lanier confesses, it's like it's, the Internet, such a failure on so many important levels that it's conceivable that people will decide it's over and try to do some other form of digital networking. The Internet might be remembered as a failed thing. It breaks my heart to even think that, and I hope it isn't true, but I'm beginning to wonder. Maybe there is still hope yet for a technology that retains a human face. As the November 16th issue of The Economist rightly summarizes, perhaps the most fitting of Mr. Lanier's 52 definitions of VR is that it is a preview of what reality might be like when technology gets better. Technology is improving. Whether reality does too depends on the technologists in charge and the power of society to shape their vision. But as I write these last lines, my youngest son, Kelly, has just taken off his Oculus Rift headset with the sweetest smile, saying, "Wow, Papa, I feel so blissful after that guided VR meditation. Let's do it together so we can share what it is like living on another solar system." I am enough of the artist to draw freely upon my imagination. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. Albert Einstein, Saturday Evening Post, 1929. The Radiant Form. How mixed reality will transform us and the world we live in. Any real virtual reality enthusiast can look back at VR science fiction. It's not about playing games. The Matrix, Snow Crash, all this fiction was not about sitting in a room playing video games. It's about being in a parallel digital world that exists alongside our own, communicating with other people, playing with other people. Palmer Luckey, founder of Oculus Rift. Humans are augmenters. We have a long history of not only altering our landscape, but our very bodies. Given our ancestral past and our evolutionary need to adapt to changing environments, we have fashioned clothes for climate protection, disfigured our flesh, and built a kaleidoscope of tools to better navigate our Darwinian sojourn here on terra firma. We are naked apes no longer, and perhaps never were once we branched out from our predecessors. In one very real sense, and echoing the deep insights of Buddha, we are fractured creatures in a cosmos that is filled with unimaginable suffering. In order to survive this requisite death match, our brains developed a sophisticated buffering system that shields us from becoming too aware of our existential plight. Natural selection is not only blind, but it has also blinded us from too much data, lest we smother ourselves from informational overload. Like our mythic progenitors Adam and Eve after the fall, we woke up to a cursed world, and we are hell-bent, an instructive if ironic pun in this context, to change all that is not to our preferences. Indeed, human culture may be defined as our continued attempt to recreate the world according to our desires and wishes. We may fear our tribal god, but that doesn't mean we have to like his/her creation. We have developed several approaches in reframing the cosmos, but two are fundamental. 1. Recalibrating our thoughts. Religion and mysticism are forerunners here, to better handle what is on offer. And 2. Manipulating matter to make our daily struggles easier. Both avenues, of course, are not mutually exclusive and are analogously akin to the interface between software and hardware. Rearranging bits of atoms, however, is a cumbersome project, and it has often taken years, even decades, to build our dream monuments, whether it is the Great Pyramids of Egypt or the exquisite Taj Mahal in India. Naturally, it is much easier to transform our thoughts about the world at large than to rearrange nature to our fancy. Yet we are on the very threshold of doing both in ways quite unimaginable a century ago. Enter the new era of mixed reality, where we transform the appearance of atomic bits into almost anything we wish, and all of this by donning a standalone virtual reality headset. Simply put, we now have the technological capability to radically modify our spatial landscapes, not by rearranging chunks of elements from one place to another, but by overlaying their innateness with dynamic and mind-boggling overlays. Take as just one instance your office. Look around at the walls, the floor, the desk, the windows, and whatever else you have filled the room with. Now, imagine being able to creatively alter the appearance of all that you see. The walls turn from white to an exploration of the Milky Way. The wooden floor changes into a blue ocean. The windows transform into portals of ever-changing impressionist artwork. And your desk becomes a Star Trek-like command module. With a stroke of your hand, the music alternates to fit your mood, and the very things you touch feel unlike what you expected. And you seamlessly assume an alien body, such as Klaatu, or your favorite animal, such as a giraffe, a panoply of avataric possibilities. To be sure, your office material has not commutated one atomic bit, but its entire display and what you see and hear, and, yes, even touch, has undergone a magical metamorphosis. Our imagination can now redraw the contours of our world, and do so at the click of a button or with a wave of our augmented hands. That the future is here now came into sharper relief this past week when my technologically literate son, Sean, and I were fortunate to be invited to attend the Oculus Connect 5 conference in San Jose, California, where the latest innovations in virtual and augmented reality were on display. The conference is primarily geared for VR developers and thus has a number of very technical workshops on game and film development. What impressed me most, however, were keynote talks by Oculus's CFO Michael Abrash and CTO John Carmack. These two computer programming pioneers gave extraordinarily lucid outlines of the future of VR and AR. I had attended the Oculus Connect 4 conference last year at the same venue, but was a bit shocked to realize how much progress had been made in the intervening 12 months. What those unfamiliar with VR may not realize is how quickly the field has evolved. It was only 8 years ago when I was teaching my upper division science and religion course at California State University, Long Beach, when a young 18-year-old student with the perfectly appropriate name, Palmer Luckey, at the same institution was tinkering away at home, building his own makeshift virtual reality headset from discarded and used components. Just 4 years later, Palmer sold his headset and company, Oculus Rift, to Facebook for over $2 billion. In the past 3 years, we have witnessed an explosion of VR devices and related products, ranging from HTC's Vive to Samsung's Gear to Oculus Go. While it is true that the general public hasn't yet truly warmed to virtual reality, the fact remains that the field is still in its infancy, and we have yet to see its full potential unleashed. Until now, that is. What Abrash and Carmack and other VR pioneers showed us was that we now have the ability to transform the world around us wirelessly without being tethered to a high-end desktop computer. The natural and artificial worlds are becoming one, and what this portends is so radical that it will upend everything we do, from work to play to lifestyles to sports to communication to our love lives. As Elon Musk rightly pointed out recently, We have already become cyborgs because of how often we use our smartphones and tend never to go anywhere without them. We have computerized ourselves by amplifying our understanding of the world with a device that allows us access to enormous amounts of information at the touch of a button or through the modulations of our voice. The first step beyond smartphones and watches is enclosed VR, and then onwards to AR, where we can seamlessly place all sorts of useful objects in real space and time. But both of these are merely steps to the real revolution that awaits us, where we mix reality with whatever we desire or imagine. Interestingly, we may not yet get rid of our smartphones, since they may serve as powerful computers and battery storage devices in our pockets, which can, via Bluetooth, power up our lightweight VR/AR glasses. A good example of where we are heading, even if at first it may seem far-fetched, can be gleaned from the movie version of Ernest Cline's widely read novel Ready Player One, published in 2011, which Steven Spielberg made into a movie 7 years later with dazzling special effects. The plot is centered in the year 2045, where the main character lives in squalor, but is freed from his slum life the moment he dons his VR headset and his entire surroundings become wondrously transfigured. I'm surprised that VR has come about so quickly. It's lucky I just happened to write a book imagining virtual reality right on the cusp of it actually happening. Ernest Cline, author of Ready Player One. Essentially, we are making our dreams actualized in an externalized realm. As I mentioned in a 2015 essay months before the first Oculus Rift was shipped, and where Google Cardboard was the cheap entry into VR realms, if consciousness evolved as a virtual simulator to help us better resource varying survival strategies before outsourcing them, we can readily see that humans have now progressed to the point where we can actualize our imaginings in a real world. Simply put, our technology has finally caught up with our dreams so that we can consciously inhabit what we could only before imagine. We are on the threshold of replacing our spiritual Atman project with an electromagnetically gifted avatar project, where arduous meditational practices are replaced with supremely easy VR headsets so that we can transcend the limits of our physical bodies and fly unencumbered in mental wonderlands. Aldous Huxley was correct when he predicted that we would enter a brave new world, but it is a different kind of soma we will daily ingest than the one he anticipated. The drug of the future is virtual, and it is information without boundaries. 3 years ago, some believed such talk was merely hype, but in the interim we can see that what lies ahead is almost beyond our comprehension, since where the borders of what is real and what is artificial will blend in ways that will eventually make them appear indistinguishable. Of course, CGI effects in films have already exceeded the Turing test, where that which is computationally generated is taken as organically real. With mixed reality, we will CGI anything we choose whenever we wish, and, in the process, add multiple layers of informational texture on even the most mundane of objects. But what struck me most during the Oculus Connect 5 conference was when Michael Abrash demonstrated the next iteration of digital avatars, where, instead of cartoonish surrogates in VR, we can have nearly exact replications of our very faces and bodies in cyberspace. Thus, instead of 2D FaceTime on a cellular gadget, we can, in virtual reality, have full incarnations that look and sound just like us, with each mouth, eye and hand gesture mimicking whatever we do in our own private homes, even if we are separated from our friends or family thousands of miles away. We will be present even when we are not there. The most remarkable feature of great VR is that one feels a sense of presence when other disembodied avatars appear and join you in Echo Arena or Unspoken, or just hanging out in your own self-generated VR living room. It is both a spooky and an uncanny feeling. This neurological trickery, convincing us that an image is real or an effect is a cause, is what makes VR magical. But when the virtual can overlay the real world, as in mixed, then we have crossed over into a completely new experience. We are on the threshold of an informational singularity, which can be likened to a black hole, where all we can know now is at the event horizon, but not what is beyond. Although it is still in a very rudimentary stage, my son Sean got a partial glimpse into mixed reality when at the conference he tried out The Void, which is advertised by the company that operates them around the country as a full sensory immersive experience with you, your friends and family walking around inside the action. It's location-based entertainment. That means you visit one of our locations and you walk into real-time hyper-reality that combines interactive sets, real-time effects, and amazing technology. Sean, who has been at the forefront of VR gaming since its inception, he has won a number of competitions around North America, told me that mixed reality, though still in its infancy, was quite mind-blowing and is clearly where our technological interactions is heading towards. As for myself, I got the chance to beta test the forthcoming Oculus Quest standalone headset that allows for 6 degrees of freedom, motion tracking, and the ability to use it anywhere and any time. Zuckerberg announced that the commercial product would be released in spring of 2019. I was taken to a scaled-down version of a tennis court and was allowed to move around as if playing a real game. As I donned the headset, I was transported into an animated arena, and I immediately felt that I was somewhere else. And as I played against my opponent, manifested as a cartoon figure reminiscent of a character from the old Wii sports game, I reacted as if in the real world, despite it being merely a sophisticated computational simulation being produced by the VR headset I was wearing. After the trial, I was wonderstruck, thinking about how much life will change in the years to come, especially in the way we relate to each other, since distance and presence can be greatly augmented. It is one thing to hear the voice of your brother 8,000 miles away or FaceTime in 2D, but quite another when the same family member can teleport his fully formed avatar into your living room and interact with you. Now add enhanced haptics where one can truly feel their environment and interact with it purely through touch, pushing, pulling and grabbing with no buttons or touchpads required, and the simulated environment comes alive. There is another angle that is important to remember here. The very best VR headset in the known universe is our own 3 pounds of glorious meat, our brains. We don't see exterior reality as it actually is in some ultimate Kantian sense, but rather as our bodily mechanisms filter selected incoming data streams and then recreate temporary models about what is surrounding us. We are, in sum, already living in a virtual reality, since all that we experience is done through a channeled medium that conceals much more than it reveals. Therefore, with VR, we are merely tinkering with our own neurological presets in order to refashion and reframe the perceived physical limits of the world that surrounds us. This endeavor is not something new, since humans have been monkeying with their environment since the dawn of self-reflective awareness. What is new, though, is how quickly we can amend our various habitats computationally without resorting to heavy lifting of core materials. The information age is indeed exponentially progressive. The implications of mixed reality are staggering, and all sorts of best and worst-case scenarios come to mind that will have either delightful or disastrous consequences, particularly when such is directly connected to artificial intelligence. In terms of education, my own field of interest, I can readily see how VR, AR, MR will dramatically change instruction. Instead of lecture halls with professors droning on for hours on end, the student can have his or her own Socrates, Aristotle, Einstein, or Niels Bohr in avataric garb and interact as if such luminaries were actually present. Couple these digital geniuses with access to the worldwide web of information, and one can learn like never before, and at each person's own learning gradient. Even in religion, it won't be very difficult to have one's chosen Ishta Devata summoned on command, whether it is Jesus, Nanak, Buddha, Mahavira, or one's own personal guru. Meditational practices can be greatly enhanced with direct avatar guidance, where one-on-one exchanges will become commonplace. The radiant form of those we love and adore will manifest accordingly, and we too will assume illuminated garments of our own choosing. All of this, I know, may seem like techno-hyperbole in our overwrought age of all things digital, but if we look back over the past several decades, we can readily see why this is not the case. For instance, envision going back to the Space Center in Houston in 1969 for the NASA moon landing and showing those operating the vast computer network your iPhone X and what it can do. How would they react? Especially when you show off its size as 6.2 by 3.05 by 0.3 inches, and that it weighs less than 8 ounces. As ZMEscience.com points out, your smartphone is millions of times more powerful than all of NASA's combined computing in 1969. What we take for granted today would seem inconceivable 49 years ago. If you have perfect virtual reality eventually, where you'll be able to simulate everything that a human can experience or imagine experiencing, it's hard to imagine where you go from there. Palmer Luckey. I recall when I was 11 years old going to see the James Bond movie You Only Live Twice with my childhood friend Scott Robbins. It was an early 11:45 a.m. showing at the famous Grauman's Chinese Theatre, and we enjoyed ourselves immensely. However, after we left the darkened theatre in the early afternoon, I was overcome with a slight, unnerving depression as I came into the daylight and walked on Hollywood Boulevard, since everything looked quite drab in comparison to the bright clarity of the film's setting in Japan and the wizardry of James Bond's various exploits. This melancholy feeling was similar, but even stronger, when I would visit Disneyland with my family, only to have to leave the Magic Kingdom at night and enter back into the real world through the bleak parking lot that adjoined the amusement park. I think many of us get these somber feelings whenever we experience something that we really enjoy but which is temporary, and which, after a set duration, thrusts us back all too soon to the ordinariness of day-to-day existence. Perhaps this is why having the freedom and the control to remake our worlds is so appealing. VR, AR, MR, and their future iterations have become viable technological tools for us to recreate the cosmos that we were born unconsciously into. As Nietzsche indicated, when we are liberated from the shackles of a prescribed God and a preordained mode of existence, we are free to choose our own meanings, our own values, and our own lives. In sum, we now have the technology to recast what before was immovable and too often intolerable. We came into the world and didn't like what we saw, and for eons tried to accommodate ourselves to these strange surroundings. Being a stranger in a strange land, to crib one of Robert A. Heinlein's more famous science fiction book titles, we have evolved to remodel our planet, and like the Judeo-Christian God of old, we want to make it in our own image and find it good. Instead of one given universe, we wish to live in metaverse, where that which is virtual and that which is augmented can intersect with our natural environs, and where we live and who we are can be made infinitely elastic, so that the only borders are the limits of our imagination and how far it will take us into the new frontier of our digital wonderland. What the computer in virtual reality enables us to do is to recalibrate ourselves so that we can start seeing those pieces of information that are invisible to us but have become important for us to understand. Douglas Adams. The Chandian Revolution. Demythologizing Radhasomi Beliefs. Over 2 decades ago, I wrote a controversial essay entitled "The Guru Has No Turban," wherein I argued that perfect masters don't exist and that spiritual teachers of whatever stripe are, to echo Nietzsche, human, all too human. I have long felt that the real underlying problem in the politics of gurudom is the gross hyperbole surrounding so-called spiritual masters. Instead of simply stating that so-and-so, fill in the blanks, gives good advice on meditation, there is a tendency in various religious organizations to elevate him or her to unqualified heights of glory and power, forgetting in the process that the guru in question has clay feet like the rest of us, even if he or she has access to levels of consciousness far beyond our present capacity. This first came into sharp relief for me when I met Baba Fakir Chand in the summer of 1978. Although Fakir had been duly appointed by his own guru, Shiv Brat Lal, and had the express support of Sawan Singh of Radhasomi Satsang Beas, he stopped formally initiating anyone by 1942. Fakir had come to realize that all internal visions in meditation were projections of our own mind, but we mistakenly believe our chosen masters miraculously project them to us. Instead of gurus telling their disciples that they have no paranormal power, they hide this secret in order to gain power, wealth, and fame. It is a sham. Because of this deception, Fakir wanted to liberate spiritual devotees from this misconception that their respective gurus were omniscient and perfect. They are not. It is the disciple's own faith and devotion which is the real modus operandi empowering the inner quest. Yes, the outer guru can be quite helpful, but it is up to the disciple to actually do the practice. It is not commonly known among Radhasomis that Sawan Singh, 1858 to 1948, honorifically called the Great Master of Beas, got sued in court by one of his own disciples. Om Prakash Kaushal, in his groundbreaking study, The Radhasomi Movement, 1891 to 1997, details what happened. Gyani Harchand Singh Labana, General Secretary of Vichani Sabha, was a staunch opponent of S. Sawan Singh. His complaint was that he was badly beaten in 1933 by the Radha Somis at Dera Baba Jaimal Singh, Beas. He wanted to take revenge on S. Sawan Singh. He instigated one of S. Sawan Singh's disciples, Naitar Singh, to file a suit against the Guru in the judicial court at Amritsar. In the suit, he said that the Guru had promised to make him see God within his physical body at the time of initiation. Naitar Singh alleged that at the behest of the Guru, he resigned from service and had to suffer a loss of 8,000 rupees, but the Guru had not fulfilled his promise. Therefore, either the loss of a huge amount should be recovered from the Guru, or he should show God to Naitar Singh. In this case, S. Sawan Singh appeared before the judge and made the following statement. Undoubtedly, God is within him, and the process to reach and see his him has been explained to the claimant. But according to my instructions, he did not labor hard, honestly. Therefore, he could not meet him, God. Ultimately, on June 12, 1934, the suit was dismissed and S. Sawan Singh was acquitted of the charge. Here, Sawan Singh explicitly points out that it is up to the disciple, not the Guru in question, to do the heavy lifting in meditation. Fakir felt strongly that the very concept of perfect master and Sat Guru was wrongly used, and as such has led to massive delusions on the part of those initiated by teachers employing such titles. A close analysis of any so-called perfect master will quickly show that anyone assuming such a title will not be able to live up to it. Instead, there will be all sorts of cracks in the titular armor, despite whatever desperate rationalizations we may invoke to band-aid together the searing discrepancy between theory and praxis. The mistake resides in the exaggerated claims published and broadcasted in much of Radhasomi literature that, when read or interpreted literally, puts the disciple in the untenable position of having to blind him or herself from the obvious fact that their beloved teacher has limitations. I remember one particular incident back in December of 1983 while I was studying in New Delhi that captured in a nutshell the fundamental problem inherent in overly embroidered guru rhetoric. 4 of us had just come back from a prolonged stay at the Radhasomi Satsang colony at Beas, where Charan Singh was then the presiding spiritual leader. A young seeker was detailing his impressions of Charan, and though he was quite impressed with the Beas guru, he couldn't accept the idea that he was perfect or that he was God incarnated. Instead, he thought of Charan as a nice, perhaps even elevated human being. I immediately nodded my head in agreement, but right then an old-time satsangi woman got heated and shouted out, "He is not a man, he is God." Fortunately, I recalled what Charan himself had said about this issue, since he had talked about it in a question-and-answer period just days before at an evening meeting in the guest house. Charan very clearly stated that it is intellectually impossible to believe that the Master is God. We may try to hold such a belief system, we may even have faith in such a concept, but eventually the mind and its doubts will have its way, particularly if one has day-to-day contact with the spiritual teacher or has access to different sources of information not yet sanitized by the organization. The late Professor Bennett Berger, who was the chairperson of my doctoral committee at the University of California, San Diego, developed a very useful concept in sociology entitled ideological work. where one attempts to reconcile the difference between an ideal and its practical manifestation. The amount of ideological work one must engage in order to resolve the contrariety speaks volumes about the apparent contradiction. When the discrepancy between ideal and outcome is small, then usually one spends very little time resolving the dispute. If, however, the incongruity is large, then one's apologetics increase accordingly. I mention this because all of us, to some measure, indulge in such rationalizations if our chosen idealizations fall short and we still want to hold on to them. Sometimes, however, the hypocrisy is too much, and we are forced, even if at first unwillingly, to change course and adopt a new model, hopefully one more resistant to attack. This reminds me, of course, with limited import, of the famous children's story called The Three Little Pigs. There are many versions of it, some of which date back to the mid-19th century and before, but they each revolve around a central point. How well prepared is each pig's house when the big bad wolf comes by? In one popular version, the first pig builds his house out of straw, the second out of sticks, and the third one out of bricks. The wolf then attempts to break down each house by blowing on them. The house of sticks goes down easily, the second one with more effort, and the third one not at all. The moral of the story is obvious. Best to be fully prepared so as to avoid a future disaster. In an analogous way, and keeping in mind that we should not push this metaphorical comparison too far, we are moment to moment building models about reality depending on the situation and what information is available to us. Our simulations work to the degree that they allow us to navigate the world around us and make reasonably accurate predictions about what we should expect in future moments. But as we all know, often our models are wrong or incomplete, and we need to recalibrate them accordingly. No model in science is perfect, but the best ones remain as guiding maps to the degree that they resist falsification. Arguably, science is based on the recognition that prototypes need to be competed and tested in order to allow for more accurate and comprehensive ones to flourish until they too are replaced or augmented by even better models. Yet, if we merely bow down to a preset paradigm, believing that such is inviolate, then we will remain unprepared when new and contrarian information appends what we previously held to be unimpeachable. Ironically, the deeper lesson of the Three Little Pigs isn't that a brick house is perfect, but only that it withstood the wolf's most damaging winds. Given a bigger and stronger wolf, a more robust test, the third pig's house too may tumble. Likewise, no model in science is perfect, but the best ones remain as guiding maps to the degree that they resist falsification. Thus, instead of being mired in continual ideological work, justifying what may in the long run be unjustifiable, the religious aspirant could be better off developing a wider, more inclusive understanding of the spiritual process, one which accepts and acknowledges the Guru's aberrations precisely as that, and not legitimizing them under the guise of crazy wisdom or some other intellective dodge. As stated in the essay, The Projective Arc, this procedure creates within the disciple a persistent tendency to take his or her experiences and filter them within the interpretive nexus that is provided by his or her spiritual path. But in so doing, the student all too often ends up trying to relate what transpires in meditation to the expectations or desired aims of the religious matrix in which she is grounded. And in other instances, the disciple begins to justify or legitimize a given spiritual paradigm by injecting it with his own internal elevations. Such a dyadic loop can literally tether the aspirant to a given theology and lock him or her into a set series of bounded interpretations. The danger, of course, is that this two-way intersection tends not to be open to alternative explanations, which might be more viable, and also prevents a freer form of exploration. Analogously, this is akin to an ocean explorer like Columbus, who consistently tries to conform new lands and new vistas with a prefigured map that he brought with him before his voyage. That he may be wholly mistaken in his conflations doesn't readily occur to him, and thus whatever newness that arises in his expeditions is refashioned to fit in with his preconceived model. This kind of habit can, if not checked, lead to one trying to substantiate the given map versus letting the newness or virginal state dictate a reformation. To summarize, the perfect master ideal doesn't work simply because it will eventually crack under closer inspection, since anyone opting to adopt that moniker is a human being. As Plotinus long ago pointed out in his Aeneads, but humanity in reality is poised midway between gods and beasts, and inclines now to the one order, now to the other. Yes, some spiritual teachers can indeed be remarkable, but that is precisely because they achieved greater heights within their very humanity, not outside of it. One oft-told saying captures this dilemma well. If these so-called masters are perfect or God, they are doing an infinitely lousy job, given what power they should possess. But if these masters are mortal and vulnerable like the rest of us, then some of them are doing a pretty good job. The koan that confronts us, and one that was voiced repeatedly by Fakir Chand and others, is that we don't even know our own selves, much less the ontological status of the gurus we love. Hence, we are the ones who must undergo the transformation and embark on the journey. Surrogate gurus won't do it for us. As the essay The Disappointing Buddha concludes, Ken Wilber's Atman project is a process of delay, a postponement of confronting the reality of our situation. As the wise sage from Hoshiarpur smartly opined, "O man, your real helper is your own self and your own faith. But you are badly mistaken and believe that somebody from without comes to help you. No Hazrat Muhammad, no Lord Rama, Lord Krishna, or any god or goddess or guru comes from without. This entire game is that of your impressions and suggestions which are ingrained upon your mind, through your eyes and ears, and of your faith and belief. But are we ready to transcend our projective arcs and proceed unencumbered and unknowing into the source from which our very consciousness arises? Or are we more predisposed to rely on proxy representatives to do our bidding? If we succumb to the latter option, we are left to be spectators to our own journey. Yes, it will be safer, less demanding, and temporarily satisfying, but in the end it will leave us empty and spiritually vacuous. Ever since I first read Edward Fitzgerald's highly idiosyncratic, yet profoundly beautiful all the same, translation of Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, one particular stanza has stood out to me and has served as a sort of Nicholas of Cusa-like touchstone for me over the years. He writes, "Myself when young did eagerly frequent doctor and saint, and heard great argument about it and about, but evermore came out by the same door as in I went." Grounding ourselves in what we do not know can liberate us from our projected delusions of grandeur about others. The bubble of our existence may rest upon an infinite ocean, but by its very nature is bound to pop. Infinity always exceeds its finite incarnations and transcends whatever limitations we attempt in vain to place upon it. The neural seduction, looking for the meta-narrative of our lives. The other night, as I was discussing evolutionary theory and the prime directive in life, live long enough to reproduce, in my Introduction to Philosophy course at Mount San Antonio College, one of my students asked a very pertinent question. Then, given this, how can we explain suicide? It is a good question, and echoes back to Albert Camus' famous passage which he penned when he was only 28 years old. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games. One must first answer. And if it is true, as Nietzsche claims, that a philosopher, to deserve our respect, must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply, for it will precede the definitive act. These are facts the heart can feel, yet they call for careful study before they become clear to the intellect. While there are many ways to tackle my student's query, as well as properly digest Camusian thinking, I think the simplest and most far-reaching answer is one that is tinged with irony and, in the spirit of Friedrich Nietzsche, transvalues the question and turns it upside down. Given the utter brutishness of life on planet Earth, where the dictum "eat or be eaten" is a literal fact, the real issue is how we would want to persist living here at all, particularly given how much we will suffer only to end up dying. In other words, what is it that can sustain us to remain here on this earthly terrain? Here I would argue that Darwinian evolution provides us with a deeply insightful answer which is intertwined with how self-reflective awareness operates when confronted with an apparently intolerable environment. Homo sapiens have been both blessed and cursed with an evolved brain that developed an inordinate capacity for sophisticated languages. This allowed us a deep reservoir of varying forms of self-awareness where we could virtually project into the future all sorts of endgame scenarios, while on the other end of the spectrum being able to reflect and ruminate over past actions and failed plans of action. In sum, we went beyond the boundaries of mere instinct and got a penetrating glimpse into the horridness of what existence is like, not only for us on occasion, but also for the vast majority of differing species who struggle to survive. It is in this context why, as humans, we have been driven to find an overarching reason to persist in this life and death game. In other words, the great philosophical question is not whether to terminate ourselves or not, but what will it take for us to live out the duration of our lifespan to its fullest. Lest we forget, evolution is not a prescription for who or what should survive, but rather an after-the-fact description of those life systems that do emerge and which can successfully replicate their winning combinations to the next successive generation. In this way, not only is evolution blind, it is not a force at all. There is no drive in nature towards anything, since that very term is itself merely our own limited way of imputing intention upon the process that is devoid of it. Another way to understand life and its complex emergence is to ponder its absence. Nothing individually succeeds for very long on this planet, and those organisms that have are an infinitesimally small minority compared to those who didn't get the chance. It would appear that the universe we find ourselves in isn't one with a purpose, despite the very odd and, at first, counterintuitive fact that those life forms which maturate goal-oriented behavior tend to flourish. As Tom Blake, author of the essay Voice of the Atom, put it, "Nature is without sentiment, but those creatures that through time can develop a sense of belief and aspiration, even in a cosmos absent of both, are temporary survivors in this cruel lottery game we call life." Much of this, though, is directly correlated to how our central nervous system advanced, especially in light of its triunic confusion where our reptilian, mammalian, and cerebral aspects don't always conjoin in perfect harmony. The instinctual part of our brain does everything unconsciously and must react instantaneously when confronted with its own termination. Here the operative instruction, coded over eons of trial and error events, where we have no records of how many failures there may have been, is to keep us alive and breathing. I got a first-hand glimpse of this the other day, surfing some rather large waves from Hurricane Rosa at Newport Beach. I had one particular wipeout where I got tumbled over and over again, and as I was losing oxygen, my instincts went into overdrive, and my body reacted accordingly, and I found myself on the surface of the water gasping for air. Whenever our bodies are put into critical situations, we are fortunate that our hind brain kicks in and responds accordingly. However, when it comes to our emotional selves, what neuroscientist Paul D. MacLean terms the paleo-mammalian structure, though much of its biochemistry transpires at levels below our fully conscious threshold, provides us with some latitude with which to modify its impact, though this varies widely with each individual and is dependent on a number of factors, including environmental. At times we can play out the potential consequences of one action versus another. This is particularly true after the advent of self-reflective awareness, when the neocortex became operational, and we possessed the ability to virtually simulate a Rolodex of possibilities. The almost infinite range of our imagination, fueled to a large degree by the onset of language, may be one of the key features that distinguish humans from all other animals. But what has been praised as our Darwinian gift has also too often become our Darwinian curse. Why? Because, to the degree that my consciousness allows me to portend possible future outcomes, I can foresee scenarios of absolute horror. Every parent, I suspect, who has a teenage daughter or son who comes home later than expected has thought up all sorts of bad case scenarios and has suffered simply because of such ideas. In a way, we can imagine too much, and much of that is not to our benefit. Instead of having our head buried in the ground looking for something to eat, like our distant cousins the sandpiper, we look too far ahead and think too laterally about what may or may not happen. And, as such, we can become victims to our own overwrought speculations. Thus, it would appear that our brains evolved a buffering system so as to offset our increased knowledge of death and its apparent universal applicability. Otherwise, our existential circumstances would be too overwhelming, and we may simply collapse under the realization of where we find ourselves. As I often tell my classes when discussing evolutionary theory, think of being on a roller coaster with all sorts of terrifying twists and turns, and having the foreknowledge that at the end of the ride it goes off the track into a mountain of fire and everyone dies. How can one stay seated on such a ride? wouldn't we want to jump at some point, realizing all too well how badly it will end? Or, put differently and more in line with how we have reversed Camus' great philosophical query, what would it take for us to stay on the roller coaster and not bail too quickly? There are multiple answers, but two stand out: distraction and purpose. The first way to remain riding would be to distract ourselves from what is really happening. As each of us know too well, we do this during much of our day, whether daydreaming about what we would rather be doing or being so engaged in what we are doing so as to not get too bogged down with unnecessary philosophical conjectures. We are a distracted creature par excellence, and for very good reasons. The experiences we have in awareness are somewhat dualistic, ranging from dissociative revelries, when we wander deeply off into the contours of our own mind, to those moments when we are fully attentive to the present moment. Gerald Edelman, the distinguished Nobel laureate and pioneer in consciousness studies, has explained in various publications that consciousness can be best understood in terms of two natures. As the website Academic Studies of Consciousness elaborates, Edelman makes a distinction between primary consciousness and higher-order consciousness. Primary consciousness is the ability to create scenes or complex discriminations, which he calls the remembered present. Not until you have animals that have semantic capabilities, in the case of humans, true language, do you get higher-order consciousness. If you have higher-order consciousness, you can do what an animal that has only primary consciousness can't do. You can have concepts of the past and the future, and you can develop a social self through language. Lower animals are conscious beings, but they only have primary consciousness. Conversely, humans not only have a sense of past and future, but they are able to be conscious of being conscious. Edelman's primary consciousness and higher-order consciousness appear to be somewhat similar to Antonio Damasio's concept of core consciousness and extended consciousness. Primary consciousness. Edelman uses the term primary consciousness to stand for the varieties of perceptual awareness that humans share with many animals. He locates his neural basis in a dynamic core of neuronal interactions, a dominant but constantly shifting nexus of activity that plays across the cerebral cortex, coloring the shades of our experience as its internal alliances form and break. Edelman uses two approaches to understanding how these neuronal networks came to be. The first, his theory of neuronal group selection, uses a Darwinian model to explain how such networks are generated during the brain's development, selected through interaction with the environment, and consolidated by a process of re-entry that creates stable, long-range mappings across the cortex. The second approach identifies the role of exchanges between anterior brain systems concerned with memory and the evaluation of experience and posterior regions concerned with perceptual categorization. The ultimate work of the dynamic core is to enable the infinity of discriminations summarized in the scenes of our perceptual experience, which constitute primary consciousness. Edelman believes that selfhood and subjectivity, two of the defining features of consciousness, result naturally from the ideas just outlined. Selfhood is a consequence of the grounding of all our later experiences in early perceptions of the internal environment. Subjectivity results from the unique developmental trajectory of each and every human mind. Higher-order consciousness. Edelman builds upon his theory of primary consciousness to provide for what he calls higher-order consciousness. This type of consciousness comprises an awareness of the past, the future, and the self that is aware of them. Edelman links this type of consciousness closely, though not exclusively, to our command of language and our associated semantic and/or symbolic capabilities. He also argues that neuronal complexity can best be understood in terms of the simultaneous compartmentalization and integration of brain function. The movement in Edelman's exposition from simple to sophisticated forms of consciousness indicates that his theory is conceived bottom-up. This is in contrast to the top-down theories proposed by psychologists such as Julian Jaynes and Nicholas Humphrey, who propose that normal human consciousness is post-language and is a relatively recent arrival on the biological scene. As Edelman himself elucidates, what the philosophers call qualia, the greenness of green and the redness of red, I think is a little too constricted. I believe that qualia are all the states that you are experiencing and not experiencing now. Those qualia are those discriminations. So, effectively speaking, the thalamocortical core, or dynamic core, as we call it, is responsible for giving rise to all these incredible numbers of discriminations, and qualia are the discriminations. Obviously, an animal that could discriminate in this fashion would have a selective advantage and be selected in evolution. Arguably, those organisms that have higher-order consciousness can ponder what was erstwhile imponderable and may, given this ability, be more prone to the option of conscious suicide, though it is relatively rare among the populace. While it is certainly true that other animals besides humans have killed themselves, we are not altogether certain why. Although there has been a strong resistance, some would suggest bias against recognizing the advanced cognitive and emotional abilities of many animals. A number of thinkers believe that we need to acknowledge that other life forms have a wider range of cognitive abilities than we might suspect. As Jessica Pierce, in an article for Psychology Today, which summarizes much of the work of David Peña Guzman on animal sentience, writes, "The idea that animals can and do engage in self-harming and self-destructive behaviors, even to the point of causing their own death, is challenging on many fronts. It upsets our folk belief that humans alone possess subjective awareness and are qualitatively different from animals. It suggests that animals have a level of decisional and volitional capacities that go well beyond what we typically ascribe to them." Steven Weinberg, the distinguished Nobel Prize winner in physics, is often quoted for his famously existential observation, "The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless." Nietzsche, writing a century earlier, realized that once man gave up his mythological security, he was doomed to wake up to all sorts of nihilistic possibility, and if we succumbed to anarchy, life would be unsustainable. Thus Nietzsche, ever the artistic optimist, contrary to how he is popularly mischaracterized, argued for man to become the architect of his own life, realizing that there was no objective or ontological ultimacies by which to guide his sojourn. Jorge Borges, in several of his short stories, captures the underlying essence of what I term the meta-narrative, wherein we search for an underlying meaning and directive for our existence so that we can overcome the painful truth inherent in Steven Weinberg's astute observation. As Borges notes, "I speak in a poem of the ancient food of heroes, humiliation, unhappiness, discord. Those things are given to us to transform, so that we may make from the miserable circumstances of our lives things that are eternal, or aspire to be so." In essence, we need our heroic myths, even if fanciful and hyperbolic, to provide us with hope in a hopeless world. The Darwinian twist here is that each of our various meta-narratives are neural seductions, precisely because they allow creatures to live long enough to procreate. It doesn't ultimately matter, in terms of belief and motivation, whether the stories we tell ourselves are true or not, but rather how well they succeed in galvanizing us to carry on in what Borges termed the miserable circumstances of our lives. Yet, in championing these meta-narratives, we too often get entrapped within our own hubris and confuse a Darwinian experiment with a metaphysical conclusion. Instead of realizing that our universal models tell us more about our own angst and pathos, we believe that they have some transcendental truth that stands above and beyond the biological soil which first fertilized them. A prime example of this conflation, where we confuse an evolutionary impulse for meaning with meaning itself, can be found in the integral theories of Ken Wilber, who writes with axiomatic certainty about eros and humankind's ultimate purpose in the cosmos. As Wilber posits in What is the Meaning of Life? The simplest answer is that the meaning of life is to realize ultimate unity, to realize the ultimate ground of being, to realize, in a direct, immediate experience, Godhead, or Spirit, or Brahman, or Tao. And that stands as a unique meaning among all the various meanings that have been offered, because many meanings are referred to what the traditions would call relative truth. They can go from fairly low life meanings to fairly noble meanings, but they're all relative. And so it can go from the meaning of life is to make as much money as you can, or to be as famous as you can, or to get as much power as you can. Then, moving up a little higher, the meaning of life is to find love and have love as an overpowering force in your life. To find meaning in general, to discover a particular value or a series of values that you find very important and that add meaning to your life and add a grace and joy to your life. And these include everything from belongingness all the way up to group identities and finding a community that shares your values. And then there's the idea that the meaning of life is to increase your knowledge and therefore to become more educated and to learn more and more about the world itself. All of this is going to expand your psyche and even your soul, and yet all of those are still relative truths. They come into being, they exist in time for a particular period, and then they disappear. But for traditions that divide truth into two truths, relative truth and ultimate truth, those are all relative. Ultimate truth is essentially very simple and similar, however it appears, although the wording can vary a little here and there. It is to discover and to find the ultimate reality of life, the ultimate ground of all being, the ultimate isness or thusness or suchness of all reality, the goal and the source of all manifestation itself. But whatever it is, it's an absolute. It's absolute being, absolute consciousness, absolute happiness, absolute joy. It is a timeless realization. It's the discovery of that reality which is so all-pervasive and all-pervading that it is ever present in your own awareness. And so you can't really accomplish it or achieve it or reach it. You can only recognize it. Ken Wilber, of course, is making a long-standing religious argument for the creation of the world, which echoes Teilhard de Chardin's oft-cited line that we are not human beings having a spiritual experience, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. While one may wish that this is true, we simply don't yet know that it is so. As religiously inclined humans, we tend to make absolute pronouncements on subjects we know the least about. Ironically, the guru who can tell us about how to journey in the inner regions beyond the physical cosmos and where not to go, has difficulty providing correct driving directions from his house in Delhi to the 3-star hotel 5 miles away. Yes, we desire purpose and direction, but that doesn't mean that the ultimate guidebooks offered to us at various times and in various cultures are true in some supernatural sense. They are, for the most part, half-baked and quite rudimentary attempts to resolve our existential dilemmas. Because of our impulse for meaning, we too often confuse these spiritual maps for the territory itself, never fully realizing that we should look first to the reasons why we lust for such map building. In other words, focusing on why humans long for a meta-narrative can tell us more about our situation than our naive acceptance of all such encircling templates. We are, in a metaphorical sense, living out a Darwinian-like experiment, where we, the ephemeral champions in nature's raffle, are trying to keep alive while knowing the wretched condition we are in. In this cursed scenario, any lifeboat that promises to carry us to safe harbor is welcome, even if it will eventually leak and sink before reaching its final destination. Stephen Wolfram, author of the overly worded and overly hyped, but nevertheless deeply insightful book, A New Kind of Science, has made the profound and disturbing argument that the universe is not the result of some superior intelligence we cannot grasp, but rather the result of simpler computational rules played out over time. That these codes are blind and unconscious and yet lead to enormous complexity upturns our cherished ideas of an intelligent design or designer. That the world does not appear to be the result of conscious intentionality has an anthropic basis that is reminiscent of a similar theory in quantum theory and astrophysics. Simply stated, the reason we find our universe occasionally habitable for life, even if very rare, isn't because it was compelled to do so by some Wilberian eros, but because this is but one of an almost infinite set of other universes that may not be so hospitable. Hence we can contemplate our origins because of probability. We live because of cosmic odds. Given enough bubbling universes, one that emerges for the right conditions for life will eventually house creatures that will be able to seek out their own causation. This may seem improbable, and that is because it is. That very improbability is what has tricked us into believing otherwise. As Daniel Dennett lucidly explains it, evolution works the same way. All the dumb mistakes tend to be invisible, so all we see is a stupendous string of triumphs. For instance, the vast majority, way over 90%, of all the creatures that have ever lived died childless. But not a single one of your ancestors suffered that fate. Talk about a line of charmed lives. A lottery winner may ponder how fortunate she was and think it was destined for her to win because so many unusual occurrences had to transpire before she bought the winning ticket. Change any sequence of events, even by seconds, and she wouldn't have gone to the store at the right moment. But what the lottery winner forgets to realize is that there are millions of other losers who, instead of praising fate, curse it. Chance, not divine guidance, governs who wins and who loses in the California Lotto. The same appears to be the case on planet Earth, but those who have emerged as survivors here learn too early that what they have won by becoming conscious creatures has to be played out under blood-curdling surroundings. Thus, we are neurologically tricked to conjure up all sorts of meta-narratives that will make sense in a senseless megacosm. It is little wonder, therefore, that many will opt for a Wilberian conclusion where a metaphysical and integral overlay infused with love comes replete with a happy ending, instead of accepting a Darwinian-like experiment that lacks teleology and where no one is in full command. If looked at obliquely, most of what constitutes our day-to-day existence is utilitarian. We breathe, we drink, we eat, we urinate, we copulate, we exercise, we sleep, and we do it all over again in 24-hour chunks, 365 days of the year for a lifetime of 80. In the midst of that, we contemplate why we are here and look for explanations that will keep us struggling onwards. But we already know how the plot ends, and it is neither desirable nor beautiful. Thus, we discover that any meaning is better than no meaning, provided that such meaning will make us live another day, even if such meaning is utter nonsense. What we desire is something to believe in, particularly if that belief elevates our humdrum existence beyond the urinal we visit too often daily. Scott London, writing his review of Ken Wilber's autobiographical book, One Taste, for Parabola magazine, writes, "Someone once observed that there are at bottom two kinds of writers, those who write what they know and those who write in order to know. Wilber clearly belongs to the former camp. His instincts are always explanatory rather than exploratory. His goal is always to reveal rather than discover. As such, his writing simply doesn't lend itself to compelling autobiography." London's pithy observation is telling, since it underlines the very thesis of this essay. If, as humans, we can realize the very limited state of our knowledge, then we venture forth in an exploratory and experimental fashion. We take a broader scientific view of things, realizing that our observations are tentative, often uncertain, and always open for correction. We posit our theories not as dogmas, but as means for further investigation, augmentation, and falsification. But if we succumb to Wilberian conclusions where we arrogantly pontificate that we have the model of models and invoke mythic beings, such as Eros, to convert the masses to a New Age communion of spiritual oneness, then we have succumbed to what a resurrected Paul Kurtz might label the transcendental explanation, one which at each turn betrays the very obvious limitations of our cranial capacities. This doesn't mean that spiritual theorists, such as Wilber, may not have good insights or that they may be eventually correct in their mystical worldviews, but only that a very questionable hypothesis shouldn't be prematurely accepted as factually true. We are, as the cliché rightly states, rushing in where angels fear to tread. What drives our desire for the meta-narrative or our acceptance of Wilberian conclusions is perhaps more interesting and instructive than we at first realize. I suggest it reveals more about our own evolutionary past and present than about the spiritual liberation that awaits us in some future time. Yes, it would be revelatory if, as in Carl Sagan's novel Contact, that in more comprehensively examining the number pi, we discover that there really is an intelligent intention beyond our cosmos, but we will not unlock that secret if we are premature in our theorizing and swallow speculations as laws. As As meaning-seeking creatures, we are tempted to make certain and absolute that which is neither. We are neurologically seduced at each turn by intellectual magicians who trick us into thinking that they know more than we actually do. In our search for security, we stop short our experiments and accept conclusions that are not properly inspected, and thus are unwarranted. In a Camusian way, to ward off our own physical suicide, we instead commit an intellectual harakiri, and, though this may seem tragic, it nevertheless makes perfect Darwinian sense. In carnivore land, where Herbert Spencer's dictum, self-preservation is the first law of nature, holds court, any directional aim we can invoke, even if fictional in its import, that can keep us alive and kicking will have value, even if the universe is valueless in itself. What sense is there in continuing when one has seen the future? Alan Lightman, Einstein's Dreams. The Evolutionary Labyrinth, How We Succeeded to Be Here Now and Its Existential Consequences. What sense is there in continuing when one has seen the future? Alan Lightman, Einstein's Dreams. This past week we have been witnessing a buying frenzy for the Mega Millions lottery, where close to $2 billion will go to the winners, who picks the right combination of numbers. The odds, of course, are astronomically stacked against us, since it is roughly estimated to be 300 million to 1. The eventual winner or winners will undoubtedly be stunned when he, she, them hears the news. Yet those lottery odds are nearly infinitely low when one stops to consider how rare it is for any one individual to be alive today, given what our unique configuration of DNA had to undergo before its final emergence. To win the Mega Millions sweepstakes is almost nothing compared to being alive today. Perhaps one of the best ways to picture how we came to be is to think of a cosmic maze that changes moment to moment when you enter into it. Further, imagine that each one of us, in terms of quantum structures, started our journey at the beginning of this labyrinth some 13.8 billion years ago. But in order to successfully exit this massive puzzle, our atomic patterns had to compete at each turn with countless others in this life and death race to the end. What's more is that no one knows beforehand which pathway is a dead end and which one leads onwards. The byways keep shifting in an unpredictable time lock, and the environmental conditions governing the onward journey continually modify, sometimes without any warning signals whatsoever. Another way to look at this is to reverse our material sojourn backwards. We are here because of the recombination of our parents' genes, and they in turn from their parents, and so on for thousands of years. Yet, not once did any one of our ancestors, and the pun here is intended, screw up. Ponder for a second just how many successes upon successes there must have been by necessity in our ancestral past, without one hiccup. Yet, what is often forgotten when thinking about this remarkable copulating streak is what each individual had to undergo to be finally successful. First, one must live past puberty in order to be able to replicate, which necessitates surviving for at least 13 years or so. But even then, one has to find a viable mate and make certain that your offspring don't die off too young. Yet, even if they do live past puberty, they must themselves pass on their genetic heritage, lest the line ends. All of this, and we haven't even touched upon the innumerable trials and tribulations that confront each individual daily. It is, for us, quite unimaginable, since there are so many varied probations in the lineal descent of any fortuitous DNA strand. What Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace realized, however, was that any organism that could sufficiently navigate nature's labyrinth would, by dint of such victories, be honed and shaped in the process. It is not that nature selects such winning combinations, but rather that those who are not eliminated in the proceedings get to carry on. What they carry with them, though, isn't necessarily the best, the strongest, or the most gifted characteristics. Herbert Spencer's famous and oft-repeated dictum, later adopted by Darwin as a placeholder for natural selection in his 5th edition of On the Origin of Species, of survival of the fittest, is a misleading codification. Rather, it may be more accurate to say precisely what it is: survival of the sufficient. What gets passed on is, at minimum, good enough. And even here, that often translates as just barely tolerable. Of course, we already know this, since who we date and mate doesn't have to be the very best out of 3 billion possible spouses, but merely what is acceptable at any one point in time. But even here, our mediocrity must be suitable to endure the often tortuous journey we make to ensure our genetic transposal. Today, we are indeed the sum total of those who came before us, and throughout nature's unending winnowing process, we have been adaptively designed. As Alan Lightman insightfully pointed out, we are living in an accidental universe, and because of this, those who can fruitfully multiply within such a cosmos will inevitably appear as if they were premeditatively constructed to do so. Yet nothing is farther from the truth. Evolution is not an intention. It doesn't have a conscious plan, but is a descriptive recountal of looking backwards in attempting to explain what had previously transpired. As such, therefore, its predictive power is forever intertwined with changing environmental conditions, much of which cannot be foretold. It is far easier to decipher via molecular biology what happened in the past than what will happen in the future. We are living in a probabilistic matrix which can be likened to Jorge Borges' Garden of Forking Paths, but with the added twist that such diverging paths are nearly unlimited. Yet, even though we may not be the most optimal of creatures, we are survivors nevertheless. And the odds that any one creature can be alive today is so stupendous, so overwhelming, that it can provide us with a moment, even if temporary, of glorious appreciation for the absolute wonder of it all. We, the sighted, are the end result of a blind and senseless algorithm played out over a myriad of planetary possibilities. Arguably, we are conscious creatures in a cosmos that lacks such. Therefore, we find it difficult to find comfort in a universe that is both amoral and without sentiment, especially since our lives are so brutish and short. This is our existential dilemma, and realizing the uniqueness of our present circumstance, even if such is an inadvertent trick of evolution after the fact, may be one of the surest ways of persisting in traveling through this cosmic labyrinth without giving up too soon. Simply put, an organism that wakes up to this horror show of life is forced to find a purpose to continue living, even if the reasoning we conjure to support such ambitions is ultimately nonsensical. Otherwise, we will find ourselves down a dark alley without an exit. Hence, as the title of the 2009 dystopian novel suggests, we are maze runners. In sum, we are a determinate creature, even if where we are running towards is climatically indeterminate. The tragedy of this world is that no one is happy, whether stuck in a time of pain or of joy. The tragedy of this world is that everyone is alone. for a life in the past cannot be shared with the present. Each person who gets stuck in time gets stuck alone. Alan Lightman, Einstein's Dreams. Understanding matter. Why a spiritual perspective needs science to make sense of the world. I perversely enjoyed Steve Taylor's recent essay, Beyond Materialism, precisely because I completely disagree with it. Indeed, I can summarize my disagreement with his thesis quite easily by taking his subtitle, Why Science Needs a Spiritual Perspective to Make Sense of the World, and reversing it into Why a Spiritual Perspective Needs Science to Make Sense of the World. This is not to say that Taylor's essay is without merit, but only that in championing his anti-materialism views, he is arguing against a bogeyman of his own making. For example, Taylor makes grandiose and all-encompassing statements which betray the very nuance necessary to make a cogent argument, particularly when he claims that materialism denies the reality of mind, neglecting to distinguish who precisely holds such a view, or to point out that empirical scientists don't deny the mind as such, but only that it should be understood as part and parcel of the brain that generates it. But more importantly, and the wording here is intentional even if it is an ironic pun, science's emphasis on looking for physical causes and correlations is a matter of focus. We can take any host of examples to illustrate why this attentional stance works and why the asana of science, to crib Adida's clever phrase, continues to align itself with such a posture. Simply put, it works and produces tremendous results. Science, in general, is looking for explanations behind why the world operates as it does, and because of this, it is grounded in verifying its speculations within the physical arena where we can experiment, test, compete varying hypotheses with each other, and make real-time and real-space predictions. If we want to understand why large ocean waves from the south tend only to arise during the months of April to October in California, we look first to oceanography and weather patterns, paying particular attention to storms off New Zealand or the coast of Chile, or hurricanes below the tip of Baja. Now, it could well be that the King Neptune in his divine chicanery likes to trick humans and only sends waves out from the south to mislead us into believing that massive winds generate long-distance swells. But since looking for such metaphysical beings doesn't produce any usable outcomes, we have quite understandably given up on invoking Roman or Greek gods as necessary explanations. Same holds true, of course, when we get a flat tire. It could well be that there is a Michelin ghost that likes to live off air embedded in rubber circular tubes and goes around deflating tires throughout the United States. But since we have better mundane explanations, nails, glass, wear and tear, nobody really believes in these air-sucking apparitions. Thus, it isn't that scientists are merely myopic in their emphasis on looking at the empirical world for answers, but only that such physical centering is a first line of inquiry precisely because it has been so bountiful in providing us with enormous sets of data about how certain things behave. Yet, Taylor persists in confusing science's spotlight with an overarching metaphysic, forgetting that they are two distinct issues, and conflating them together is not only misleading, but completely unnecessary. For example, just because a neuroscientist wishes to reverse engineer the brain to better understand consciousness doesn't mean that because of his or her approach that nothing but matter exists. This is an unnecessary leap, since a means doesn't equal an end. Rather, it indicates that studying the neural net and how neurons interact is a very fruitful endeavor in itself. It already has helped us better understand such neurological disorders as vascular, Lewy body, and frontotemporal dementia, not to mention how Huntington's disease causes nerve cell degeneration. Would a spirit-first agenda have discovered this? No. But if it did, and it was really fruitful in making the kind of remarkable determinations that modern neuroscience has already achieved in its field, then guess what? It, too, would be a major tool in the scientist's toolkit, regardless of whatever ism one is entrenched in. Science is practical above all else, and that is the reason why researchers concentrate on astronomy, mathematics, physics, chemistry, and biology, since those endeavors have revealed much more about how the universe at large works and our place within it than philosophies or religions which have a pan-spiritism purview. I realize there are some that abhor the word reductionism, but the fact remains that intertheoretic reductionism has been remarkably successful in explaining hitherto unaccounted-for mysteries. Does this mean that only reductionism works? No, but it does suggest that anyone interested in the paranormal, spirituality, or beyond matter would be wise to take a physicalist approach first and not disdain such a process a priori, since it appends one's cherished Istadevata. Steve Taylor seems to be in a rush, which is highlighted when he writes, "And the third major issue that materialism does not actually work well as a way of explaining the world. Its explanatory power is actually very limited. On the one hand, there are a wide range of anomalous phenomena that it cannot account for, from psychic phenomena to near-death experiences and spiritual experiences. These are rogue phenomena that have to be denied or explained away simply because they don't fit into the paradigm of materialism, in the same way that the existence of fossils doesn't fit into the paradigm of fundamentalist religion. On the other hand, there are many scientific and philosophical issues that it cannot adequately explain, such as consciousness, the relationship between the mind and the brain, and the mind and the body, altruism, and even evolution. To the contrary, scientists have made enormous progress in understanding rogue phenomena, especially since the information we garner about any so-called paranormal event tends to yield, via Occam's razor and Laplace's dictum, a less complicated explanation. The real problem, I would suggest, is that we haven't fully explored or exhausted the physicalist world enough, and instead we invoke spirits of the gaps like causations in our desire to bring back God or purpose into the proceedings. Now, it may well be that our physics and biology and psychology is insufficient to the task at hand. But we won't actually know that if we prematurely abdicate the hard work necessary and opt for unverifiable metaphysical overlays. A good example of this rush to judgment can be seen in Jeffrey Kripal's essay in The Chronicle of Higher Education, where he attempted to seduce us with stories of how researchers were ignoring amazing stories of psychic foreknowledge since they didn't fit into their preset paradigms. He even went so far as to suggest that Mark Twain had a psychic dream about his younger brother's death that couldn't be explained by science. Yet it took me, not even a Twain scholar, or should I say Samuel Clemens expert, all of 30 minutes to unearth pertinent contextual details that showed exactly why Twain had such a dream and why it was anything but psychic, given what had transpired during those momentous weeks leading up to Henry's untimely death. Over the course of time, the more information we can unearth about any so-called paranormal happening, the more likely it turns out to have a naturalistic cause. But we won't find this out if we blitzkrieg away from being patient, empirical detectives. This, again, doesn't mean that physical explanations are the sum total of reality, but only that we don't want to unnecessarily commit a Wilberian pre-trans fallacy in our hopes for a teleological drive behind evolution, or that Eros has an overall plan for our liberation. I realize that, like Karl Popper, who apparently popularized the term, advocating a physics-first approach may be criticized in some corners as promissory materialism, but such an overused canard actually betrays what science is trying to achieve. A physicalist approach is not anti-spiritual in the least, since if there really is something beyond matter, then the surest way to discover that is not by foregoing physics and biology, but by letting them fully examine the natural world through rigorous skepticism. That very skepticism will reveal what mere belief cannot. As I pointed out in the essay The Remainder Conjecture, my own hunch is that the most fruitful avenue for the scientific study of awareness is to fully exhaust a physical explanation of it first. This does not mean, of course, that such an endeavor will be successful or that consciousness is merely the result of a neural net, but only that if our efforts fail, we will be left with a most interesting remainder, which in itself will be highly instructive about the nature of awareness. More precisely, unless we fully option a materialist approach, we run the very real risk of prematurely optioning something as spiritual, when, in fact, given better instrumentation and technical prowess, it may well have been the result of subtle neuronal discharges. The good news in advocating this consilient approach is that if our self-reflective consciousness is ultimately non-physical, then our science will end up driving itself to the very brink of an epistemological cul-de-sac, and in the process reveal that which cannot be explained away. The materialist agenda, I suggest, should be fully embraced by those most engaged in a spiritual quest, since it is, ironically, the surest pathway to discover that which is immune to our rationalist inspections. Taylor's essay is not only exaggerated but quite misleading, particularly when he can write, "Materialism is hopelessly inadequate. A metaphysical paradigm which can't account for so many fundamental aspects of human experience and the world should surely be discarded. We surely deserve a more satisfactory metaphysical paradigm which can explain the world more coherently and doesn't deny the reality of so much of our experience." First, science as a process doesn't deny anyone's experience as such, but rather tries through a variety of tools to understand them. That our scientific ideas change and get corrected over time is what makes it so progressive. Second, confusing the method of science with an ontological end game is bad philosophy. Those working on the Large Hadron Collider at CERN are trying to unlock the mysteries of the atomic world by smashing protons against each other at extreme speeds. They have made extraordinary discoveries in doing such, though there is still much that remains a mystery. But do we lament their efforts because they don't opt for pan-spiritism, where one takes a consciousness-first approach? No. Like the title of my article points out, it's a matter of focus. The very discussion we are having on integral world was brought to us by those communicative and mathematical pioneers who developed ways to compress information down to its minimal substrates. Ironically, these mathematically gifted reductionists have provided us with a web of hugely semantic meaning, despite the fact that when stripped to its core, we are only using a binary code of zeros and ones by turning on and off electronic signals at the level of minuscule silicon chips. In a famous paper later published as a small book, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, Claude Shannon provides a glimpse of how this was going to be accomplished. The fundamental problem of communication is that of reproducing at one point, either exactly or approximately, a message selected at another point. Frequently, the messages have meaning. That is, they refer to or are correlated according to some system with certain physical or conceptual entities. These semantic aspects of communication are irrelevant to the engineering problem. The significant aspect is that the actual message is one selected from a set of possible messages. The system must be designed to operate for each possible selection, not just the one which will actually be chosen, since this is unknown at the time of design. If the number of messages in the set is finite, then this number, or any monotonic function of this number, can be regarded as a measure of the information produced when one message is chosen from the set, all choices being equally likely. As was pointed out by Hartley, the most natural choice is the logarithmic function. Although this definition must be generalized considerably when we consider the influence of the statistics of the message and when we have a continuous range of messages, we will in all cases use an essentially logarithmic measure. Taylor believes in his essay that, from the pan-spiritist point of view, consciousness does not emerge from complex arrangements of material particles. It isn't located in certain areas of the brain or produced by certain types of brain activity. Consciousness doesn't emerge from matter because it was already there as a fundamental quality of the universe. The brain does not produce consciousness, but it acts as a kind of receiver which transmits and canalizes fundamental consciousness into our own being. Via the brain, not just the human brain but that of every other animal, the raw essence of universal consciousness is canalized into our own individual consciousness. And because the human brain is so large and complex, it is able to receive and canalize consciousness in a very intense and intricate way, so that we are probably more intensely and expansively conscious than most other animals. The problem I see with Taylor's twist on this theory is that if consciousness is indeed a fundamental quality of the universe, I see no compelling reason why it would need large and complex brains to better display it. Moreover, and contrarian to Taylor's lamentations about all things material, studying the physical constraints of the brain should actually be first on his scientific agenda, because if, as he suggests, such complex entities are receivers and transmitters of this gravity-like force called consciousness, then understanding why such awareness waxes and wanes due to biochemistry and cranial capacity would be of elemental importance. So even here, the physicalist agenda holds court. Let me conclude with a more personal example about why I am such a strong advocate of physics and neuroscience in the study of consciousness as our commencement point. My childhood friend, Bob, has recently been admitted to a memory care loss center because of his increasingly severe dementia. Given all the possible scenarios for understanding why such a tragic thing has happened to this happy-go-lucky surfer musician, it is fairly obvious to me and to his entire family, but more importantly to his doctors, that his present disease was triggered by a serious stroke that happened to him several years prior. In looking for a cure, doctors are focusing on his brain from a purely physicalist perspective. They are not engaged in ontological arguments about whether his brain is a receiving station for some indelible spiritual force or whether materialism is bankrupt. No, they are exclusively studying the brain to see if they can find some pathway to repair what has been damaged. In sum, they are being practical, not philosophical. Or, as I have often quipped to my students in my own critical thinking courses in college, philosophy done well is science. Philosophy done poorly remains philosophy. I would suggest that the study of consciousness will benefit greatly if we keep to the matter in our heads first, before invoking imaginary forces or beings in our impatience for final answers. Can you imagine if Francis Crick and James Watson and Maurice Wilkins and Rosalind Franklin fell under Henri Bergson's spell of élan vital instead of being influenced by Linus Pauling and Erwin Schrödinger, specifically his 1943 lectures later published in 1944 as a book under the title What is Life, which encouraged them to find the secret of genetics in the physical structure of DNA. This doesn't mean that Shakespeare's Hamlet is wrong. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. But only that we won't truly get beyond matter until we have fully explored all of its subtleties first. The future of meditation. How technological augmentation will advance interior exploration. I have been practicing meditation now for over 50 years, yet it was only last week that I first tried a portable electroencephalogram (EEG) machine to study my brainwave patterns while doing sculpt yoga, an ancient technique that focuses on listening to subtle sounds while sitting still. After teaching my Monday class in the sociology of religion, my colleague, Dr. Joshua Knapp from the psychology department, came to my office and said he wanted me to try Muse, the popular brain-sensing headband. It is very simple to use and connects seamlessly with one's smartphone and purportedly records your brainwaves in 3 distinct modes: active, neutral, and calm. After a 5-minute session, for instance, which begins with a brief calibration and short introduction, it will produce a brain activity chart replete with how many minutes were spent calmly, neutrally, or actively. The fun part about the device is that it entices you to become as still as possible, since then a tiny bird sound emerges. Racking up more bird sounds is indicative of how deep you have gone into your meditation. Although it is a fairly rudimentary device, EEG machines have been used for a long time to study the brainwaves of meditators. Ken Wilber has even uploaded a YouTube video of himself sitting in bed using such a gadget. I found Wilber's video highly instructive since it warned me not to take my meditative sojourns via Muse too seriously, given the relatively crude state of our brain-reading technology. Yet I see great potential in these accessories since they allow for real-time analytics and can serve as progressive markers with which meditators can better gauge more precisely what is transpiring during their meditation sittings. It is not a stretch to imagine that in the not-so-distant future, human gurus can either be replaced or greatly aided by meditation applications that are connected with artificially intelligent agents. Even with a simple device such as Muse, the feedback loop was instructive, and I tried out a few suggestive tests on the machine. Modern sculpt yoga practice, most prominently used in Radhasomi and Sant Mat-related groups, employs a 3-fold technique: Simran, repetition of a name or names, mantra; Dhyan, contemplation, the darkness or light or guru's image within; and Bhajan, listening to the inner sound. So in a suggestive beta test, I wanted to see which of these 3 techniques would elicit the most bird chirps, which I am told can range from 1 to 59 within a 5-minute period. My hunch, or should I say hypothesis, was that bhajan, if done successfully, would garner the most bird chirps, with simran coming in a close second and dhyan coming in a distant third. Mystics in this tradition who are regarded as masters usually advise meditating between 2 and 3 hours daily, with the majority of the time spent doing simran and dhyan, whereas 30 or so minutes should be done in bhajan exclusively. For the purposes of my trial runs, I decided to follow Muse's instruction of doing a short 5-minute session at first. In each test I conducted, I focused on one technique only. Of course, it goes without saying that my experiments are only suggestive hints and shouldn't be construed as scientific. To the contrary, they merely represent potential avenues for further investigation. I was a bit surprised, though, when after 15 trials the best results I got were indeed while doing bhajan. Now, undoubtedly there can be several reasons for this, including confirmation bias. But this got me to thinking that with portable and relatively cheap EEG machines becoming more widely available, it can allow for widespread testing of various meditational methods that are more far-ranging than Sharp Yoga's 3-fold process. Hatha Yoga immediately comes to mind, especially with its emphasis on pranayama, breath restraint, mudras, hand gestures, and asanas, body postures. But meditational disciplines are not limited to yoga, since the world's religions have developed all sorts of concentrative practices, ranging from Sufi dancing to the Jesus prayer in Christian Orthodox churches. The more widespread these augmented technologies become, we will be able to develop vast databases, quantifying which techniques seem to work best and under what circumstances. Already a number of studies have been conducted using Muse, but focusing on education, not meditation. As the MedTech Boston website explained, at the University of Victoria and New York University, researchers are using the device to conduct pedagogical neuroscience research by investigating whether educational outcomes can be improved by better understanding students' brain activity. They roll out Muse in their research projects to 20 or 30 students at a time, simultaneously in a classroom, explains Moffat. They're looking at different brain states and how they affect learning, and whether or not they can improve their teaching methods on the basis of what is engaging to students and when students start to drop off. The Muse research website lists 9 examples of ongoing research connected with the brainwave reading headband, including attentional and affective consequences of technology-supported mindfulness, a randomized trial. Dr. Norman Farb's laboratory at the University of Toronto showed that 6 weeks regular use of Muse in healthy adults resulted in improvements in attention as well as reduced somatic symptoms, headaches, pain, discomfort, etc., on the brief symptom inventory. Characterizing population EEG dynamics throughout adulthood. A study by researchers at McMaster University involving more than 6,000 participants found population-level effects in brain data related to age and gender, giving scientists unparalleled resolution into how EEG brain dynamics change with age. Novel speed of learning effects detected in neurofeedback. A study by Dr. Randy McIntosh's lab at the Rotman Research Institute demonstrated previously unreported speed of learning effects in My Virtual Dream, a virtual neurofeedback environment powered by Muse. This effect, being subtle, was detectable only using a technology capable of testing a very large number of people, 600, in a short time, 12 hours. Neuroscientists study meditation-related changes in brain performance. Neuroscientists at the University of Victoria and the University of British Columbia use Muse in their field work in Nepal to study the brains of Buddhist monks who are highly expert meditators to better understand how training affects the way the brain makes decisions. Identifying pain with an adaptive brainwave learning system. Researchers at MIT and Harvard used machine learning to detect and distinguish signals associated with pain when participants wore Muse. Using Muse to measure event-related potentials outside the lab. At the University of Victoria in Canada, scientists are using Muse to measure event-related potentials, ERPs, in cognitive tasks. This research is also being applied to measure changes in decision-making in response to fatigue in ER doctors in the emergency room. Identifying mental states with machine learning. Researchers at the University of Memphis and IBM Watson Research Center found that by using machine learning to analyze brainwave signals from Muse while participants watched different videos, they could determine what type of content, emotional or educational, each participant was seeing. Vigilance lapse identification with Muse. Researchers from McMaster University used EEG machine learning tools to detect lapses in vigilance, sustained attention, state of participants wearing Muse. Integration of Muse with virtual reality. Students, scientists, and makers from around the world use Muse to create engaging and immersive experiences. One great example is Psychic VR, a virtual reality experience powered by Muse that was created by Judith Amores Fernandez, Patty Mays, and Javier Benavides Palos, which won a Fast Company Innovation by Design award. I suspect that this very last study mentioned, integration of Muse with virtual reality, will be a game changer in the future, since it will allow meditators to be fully immersed into an environment that can potentially capture each of their senses, from seeing to hearing to even touching. I have been beta testing doing meditation in virtual reality with the recently released Oculus Go, a standalone VR device that is extraordinarily simple and easy to use. I have coupled Oculus Go with Muse, though a bit awkward at first, to see how they may work together and what kind of results they may portend. Back in the 1950s, John Lilly pioneered building deprivation tanks to see how the mind responds when lacking incoming stimuli. He augmented his water-immersed sessions with certain psychotropic drugs, and the results were startling. He experientially realized that the mind, when deprived of sights and sounds and smells, would by itself virtually create a kaleidoscope of wondrous hallucinations. Although Lilly would later begin to believe that such visions were more than passing phantasms, his friend and fellow sojourner, Richard Feynman, the noted Nobel Prize-winning physicist, disagreed and became convinced of their illusory nature. Yogis in the past would often put themselves in isolated environments so as to better focus within during their deep meditations and begin to produce a sophisticated phenomenology of what they encountered. One wonders if AI-connected concentration devices will be able to accelerate the learning curve of would-be meditators who don't follow a guru and don't live in a remote cave or forest and don't ingest psychedelic drugs. My own preliminary trials and errors in this arena suggest that devices such as Muse are indeed helpful, even if limited in their present incarnation. Perhaps in a decade or more we will have a plethora of digital gurus designed to help us turn within and who will be personally aligned with our own self-interests and help us better progress to our desired goals. The future of meditation can be based more on a scientific understanding and less on an outdated mythological one. The Tibetan cave of tomorrow can be constructed instantaneously with a VR and/or AR, and each of us can have our own spiritual teachers guiding us, even if they are wearing purely technological garb. The Books of Tomorrow, a virtual reality of a living library. I have seen and heard and touched the future of books. It happened just last night as I was playing with the family's Oculus Rift virtual reality headset. Although we were early adopters of the VR system, it was only when I played the game Waltz of the Wizard that I saw how books could be potentially experienced 5 to 10 years hence. Let me set out the scene, especially for those who have never donned an Oculus or HTC Vive headset. You enter into a fully immersive 360 room, quite reminiscent of something out of Harry Potter's world of magic, and there is a multitude of interactive options. As the official Steam download site explains, Waltz of the Wizard is a virtual reality experience that lets you feel what it's like to have magical powers, combine arcane ingredients into a boiling cauldron with the help of an ancient spirit trapped in a human skull, unleash creative or destructive wizardry upon a fully interactive virtual world. As my youngest son, Kelly, explained to me before I entered into the wizard's den, almost everything is interactive. The most impressive items, from chess pieces to crossbows, to glowing globes, to musical instruments, to chairs, to illuminated swords, can all come alive depending on which spell you cast and what ingredients you put into the center cauldron. Yet what struck me so forcefully, however, was when I happened upon a book that was floating in mid-air, and I reached out and grabbed it, bringing it so close that I could almost feel its binding. It looked as real as anything I have seen in graduate school at the UC Berkeley Library. Of course, I couldn't open it there and then, since it was merely a prompt. But this got me to thinking, and then I had an epiphany about the books of tomorrow. I can see in the not-so-distant future, probably sooner than I imagine, where with the latest iteration of a VR headset, one can enter a virtual library that can be designed to look like the globed and book-lined hall in Clementinum, Prague, or the huge reading room at the New York Public Library, or, better yet, Trinity College's old library in Dublin. It will be fully immersive, and one will feel the very presence of thousands of volumes, and then one can choose any book off the shelves, and as he or she opens the tome, a series of wonderful and magical options will emerge. Choose a very comfy chair and just read, or touch the page and listen to the narrator tell you its story, or, more dramatically, let the text come fully alive and fully interactive, where one actually becomes part of the drama and witness all the characters as they unfold and develop via the storyline. You can even choose to be the main lead or any of the secondary characters, or, more tellingly, even the landscape itself. The book is now living, and it presents the reader with a cornucopia of alternatives, something completely unimaginable in years past. One will become the proceedings and become forever changed by the experience. Sounds like too much hype? I think not. We are merely at the threshold of what artificial intelligence and augmented reality can produce. 10 years ago, Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone and Jeff Bezos the first Kindle. For better or worse, these devices and their various clones have radically transformed how humans across the globe access information. What is happening now is what I call the great data seduction, where bytes dress up in all sorts of fancy garb in order to entice us to partake of their offerings. And in so doing, we become entranced in worlds upon worlds of differing mind fields, each offering a new vision, a new sound, a new touch, and a new way to experience what was before more or less nakedly unadorned. I remember my students at CSULB being in awe when I first showed them Amazon's Kindle in 2007 and how it could download a book within 30 seconds and hold hundreds of books in its memory. Today this seems quaint and a bit dated, since we don't even need to have hard drives to retain what we want, since the computing cloud follows us wherever we are. This reminds me anew of the comedian Stephen Wright's famous joke about how he had the largest seashell collection in the world. As he explained, "I have the world's largest collection of seashells. I keep it on all the beaches of the world. Perhaps you've seen it." As ironic and insightful as Wright's quip was decades ago, I never thought it could literally be true with books and that they would be available wherever we happened to be. We now have at our fingertips not merely thousands of books, but millions of them, and we have a plethora of music, art, film, and other media at our beck and call. We live in an unprecedented time of informational overload, and thus the digital world evolves in ever-encompassing ways. Where once we simply read letters on clay tablets, on papyrus, or on thin sheets of wood pulp, in the future the book will incarnate, fully formed, like an all-powerful avatar, ready to assume any form we desire, provided that it will capture our attention. Attention and time are in very short supply, and that is why virtual reality and augmented reality, even if we are Luddites who curse the postmodern age and its perpetual distractions, is our future. As Charles Dickens wrote in 1859, the same year that Darwin's On the Origin of Species was published, in A Tale of Two Cities, which also reflects almost to a T what we ourselves face when confronting our digital destiny. "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way." In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. In closing, however, I must confess that I saw in Waltz of the Wizard a magnificent future for education, where storytelling allows for unexplored vistas and voyages, where we can, and this is ironic, while sitting in our chairs, actually leave them and venture forth into Harry Potter-inspired regions where information is no longer tethered to the limitations of pen and paper. In the future, books will fly, and with them, so will we, quite literally so. It's a matter of focus. Confusing practicality with faith. I appreciate that Steve Taylor has taken the time to respond to my recent essay entitled Understanding Matter. As this will be my 150th article for Integral World, I find it appropriate that it will concentrate on why I have long championed being skeptical when it comes to paranormal claims. This is not because I have an a priori belief that the supernatural is non-existent, but only that the surest pathway to discover that which lies beyond physics and the other sciences is to let those disciplines fully and patiently attempt to explain such phenomena first. If we don't do such, we run the very real risk of accepting sleight-of-hand magician tricks as miracles, as was the case with the infamous Sathya Sai Baba, who deceived thousands with his amateurish conjuring. First, Steve Taylor makes a fundamental error when he writes, he, Lane, suggests that this makes science superior to spirituality. I have never argued that science is superior to spirituality, precisely because I view them as two distinct processes. I hold that a meditating physicist is not a contradiction in terms. Second, Taylor argues that he reverses science, and I am an enthusiastic advocate of the scientific approach. Yet, he betrays that very sentiment just a line or two later when he writes, "In order to have any real explanatory ability, science has to unmoor itself from a materialist perspective and adopt a spiritual one." Specifically, the idea that the essential reality of the universe is not matter, but consciousness. This is a confusing juxtaposition, since science is a practical endeavor, as I have stated repeatedly in a number of articles, including my original critique of Taylor, and it is because of this, and not some absolute metaphysic, that the focus has been on material causes and correlations. The reason science has been so successful is precisely because it has real explanatory ability. If it didn't, nobody would use it, nor would we see anyone advocate its use. Even non-scientists understand how successful science has been because they can literally see and interact with its magnificent technological byproducts. We can provide innumerable examples of why science's method of looking at the empirical world works, from heart and kidney transplants to space rockets to the moon and beyond, to the development of electricity and solar power. None of these endeavors needed a spiritual perspective to work. Therefore, I find Taylor's lament in this regard short-sighted, since to acknowledge the greatness of science is to realize that it has made such tremendous progress by not getting bogged down with antiquated and unnecessary religious mythologies. Third, Taylor fundamentally misunderstands the very intention of my earlier article when he writes, "The fact that Lane continuously assumes that I am criticizing science as a practice, when in fact I'm just criticizing materialism, shows that, in his mind, science is synonymous with materialism. This is a serious philosophical error." No, I have not made that mistake of believing that science is synonymous with materialism. Quite the opposite, since I have argued that it is a practical process and doesn't have to forever tie itself with an overarching metaphysic. I am not the one arguing that science lacks explanatory power because it has to unmoor itself from materialism. Taylor, not me, is the one who has a problem with science's focus on matter and what it portends. Yes, science is a method, and therefore it doesn't need an agenda of spirit to make it more powerful. Science doesn't explain away psi, but rather attempts to better understand all the possible ways it could happen without resorting to supernatural explanations. This is how it should be, because otherwise we end up accepting the silliest of parlor tricks, like bending spoons with our minds, as being beyond rational explanation. We are not skeptical enough. For example, If Uri Geller or others really do have the ability to bend spoons merely by thought and not by purchasing easily bendable metals beforehand, then the more we doubt and test them, the greater their respective abilities will shine forth. The same holds true for any so-called paranormal phenomena. No need at this stage to usher in spirit when simple physics can append bad magic tricks. Fourth, Steve Taylor indulges in a completely inaccurate exaggeration when he categorically claims scientists have made no progress in understanding rogue phenomena like near-death experience, psi phenomena like telepathy or precognition, or even consciousness itself. To the contrary, science has made tremendous progress on each of those fronts, even if many mysteries still persist. Take psi as a good example. Is the field worse or better off because some scientists have been hypercritical of how many previous tests were conducted without proper double-blind protocols in place, or that faulty statistics were employed? Does this mean, by extension, that such scientists are caught in a web of blind materialism? No, quite the opposite, since by demonstrating where and when a particular study is insufficient, they help future researchers avoid unnecessary data traps. As Percy Diaconis, Mary V. Sunseri, Professor of Statistics and Mathematics at Stanford University, wisely summarizes in his Statistical Problems in ESP Research, in search of repeatable ESP experiments, modern investigators are using more complex targets, richer and freer responses, feedback and more naturalistic conditions. This makes tractable statistical models less applicable. Moreover, controls often are so loose that no valid statistical analysis is possible. Some common problems are multiple endpoints, subject cheating, and unconscious sensory cueing. Unfortunately, such problems are hard to recognize from published records of the experiments in which they occur. Rather, these problems are often uncovered by reports of independent, skilled observers who were present during the experiment. This suggests that magicians and psychologists be regularly used as observers. New statistical ideas have been developed for some of the new experiments. For example, many modern ESP studies provide subjects with feedback partial information about previous guesses to reward the subject for correct guesses in hope of inducing ESP learning. Some feedback experiments can be analyzed with the use of skill scoring, a statistical procedure that depends on the information available and the way the guessing subject uses this information. Yet, despite Percy Diaconis's cautionary notes, he believes the field of parapsychology is an important one and shouldn't be neglected. In his concluding paragraph he writes, "To answer the question I started out with, modern parapsychological research is important. If any of its claims are substantiated, it will radically change the way we look at the world. Even if none of the claims is correct, an understanding of what went wrong provides lessons for less exotic experiments. Poorly designed, badly run, and inappropriately analyzed experiments seem to be an even greater obstacle to progress in this field than subject cheating. This is not due to a lack of creative investigators who work hard, but rather to the difficulty of finding an appropriate balance between study designs which both permit analysis and experimental results. There always seem to be many loopholes and loose ends." So, has the field of parapsychology improved because of such skepticism? The answer is a clear yes, and underlines the very point I have been making all along. By focusing on a more rational and physicalist explanation for a given psi occurrence, it provides a portal for positive experimental results that, if viable, can robustly resist falsification. A good example of this can be seen in how various Ganzfeld experiments have been conducted after critical scrutiny by such skeptics as Ray Hyman. Even a pro-psi advocate such as Dean Radin admits most of the Otto Ganzfeld experiments took advantage of lessons learned in past psi research, thereby avoiding many of the design problems discovered by early experimenters. Hence, it is not a question of science's alignment or non-alignment with an overarching philosophical purview, but rather that by focusing on the empirical arena as a starting point, it can better differentiate that which is materially generated or contextualized from that which is supernatural. Otherwise, we can be caught in an intractable web of mistaking that which is pre with that which is trans. Fifth, contrary to popular misunderstandings, even critical tomes on the paranormal will popularize where and when certain psi results suggest something extraordinary is transpiring. For instance, in my critical thinking courses, we have used a textbook entitled How to Think About Weird Things, which speaks positively about current research in Ganzfeld experiments, going so far as to argue that the Ganzfeld procedure remains the most promising way to demonstrate the existence of psi. Byrne and other well-respected psychologists remain convinced that these studies identify an anomaly that has not yet been adequately explained. A well-controlled Ganzfeld experiment may well turn out to be replicable. If it does, we may have to begin changing our worldview. This is commendable and shows that despite Taylor's protestations to the contrary, science is not amiss to discovering features to the universe which betray physicalism as we presently understand it. Indeed, I would argue, as I have in the remainder conjecture, that by fully exploring the physicality of any given event will, by that very procedure, show us the limits, if there are any, of that line of inquiry. The history of science, of course, is replete with such examples, ranging from Werner Heisenberg's 1927 Principle of Uncertainty in Quantum Mechanics to Kurt Gödel's 1931 Incompleteness Theorem, to Alan Turing's 1936 proof that an all-purpose algorithm cannot solve the halting problem for all possible program input pairs, to the qubit Perez-Garcia-Wolf 2015 mathematical proof that shows the spectral gap problem for families of quantum spin systems on a two-dimensional lattice with translationally invariant nearest neighbor interactions are fundamentally undecidable. Sixth, Taylor tends to use straw person, or what I previously called bogeyman, arguments when he misleadingly claims materialism does not and should not have a monopoly over science as a practice. Science is a free enterprise, and no one is restricting anyone from doing the method. Taylor apparently keeps forgetting my central thesis is that the very reason scientists have tended to look for physical causes and correlations is because it produces practical and usable results. Taylor and other of like mind are free to do consciousness-first research. Who exactly is holding them back? In this regard, there are a number of eminent thinkers who have taken a consciousness-first approach, such as Donald Hoffman at the University of California, Irvine. My wife, Andrea Diem, who also did pioneering brain research with V.S. Ramachandran at the University of California, San Diego, even wrote a brief article outlining his approach. Dr. Diem wrote, "Although significant progress has been made in the past 30 years, the sticky problem of qualia, what Chalmers calls the hard problem, is still a Gordian knot that has yet to be unraveled. While many neuroscientists are attempting to reverse engineer the brain and develop simulation models of how a set of 86 billion neurons could be responsible for generating self-reflective awareness, other maverick scientists have taken a much more radical approach by arguing for a consciousness-first principle, similar in some ways to the argument posed by Ramana Maharshi and Advaita Vedanta. Professor Donald Hoffman at the University of California, Irvine, is one of those thinkers at the forefront of championing a new approach to understanding human awareness. Instead of focusing on a reductive neurological explanation, Hoffman believes that it may be more fruitful to start precisely with what we ourselves know day to day and moment to moment, our own consciousness. As Professor Hoffman explains, I believe that consciousness and its contents are all that exists. Space-time, matter, and fields never were the fundamental denizens of the universe, but have always been, from their beginning, among the humbler contents of consciousness, dependent on it for their very being. The world of our daily experience, the world of tables, chairs, stars, and people, with their attendant shapes, smells, feels, and sounds, is a species-specific user interface to a realm far more complex, a realm whose essential character is conscious. It is unlikely that the contents of our interface in any way resemble that realm. Indeed, the usefulness of an interface requires, in general, that they do not. For the point of an interface, such as the Windows interface on a computer, is simplification and ease of use. We click icons because this is quicker and less prone to error than editing megabytes of software or toggling voltages in circuits. Evolutionary pressures dictate that our species-specific interface, this world of our daily experience, should itself be a radical simplification, selected not for the exhaustive depiction of truth, but for the mutable pragmatics of survival. If this is right, if consciousness is fundamental, then we should not be surprised that, despite centuries of effort by the most brilliant of minds, there is as yet no physicalist theory of consciousness, no theory that explains how mindless matter or energy or fields could be or cause conscious experience. There are, of course, many proposals for where to find such a theory, perhaps in information, complexity, neurobiology, neural Darwinism, discriminative mechanisms, quantum effects, or functional organization. But no proposal remotely approaches the minimal standards for a scientific theory: quantitative precision and novel prediction. If matter is but one of the humbler products of consciousness, then we should expect that consciousness itself cannot be theoretically derived from matter. The mind-body problem will be to physicalist ontology what black-body radiation was to classical mechanics. First, a goad to its heroic defense, later, the provenance of its final supersession. Before thinking that Hoffman has descended into the Deepak Chopra land of woo-woo science, to cite famed skeptic Michael Shermer's oft-cited descriptive moniker for New Age thinking, what makes Hoffman's approach so unique and refreshing is that he is fully aware that he may be wrong and is strenuously trying to mathematically shore up his hypothesis and show through rigorous analysis that one can actually derive the known laws of physics, particularly quantum mechanics, through a consciousness-first methodology. Yet, the key here again is one of practicality, not propping up a metaphysical agenda. Hoffman wants his theory to be falsifiable, which means that he could simply be wrong. That is the way of scientific progress, whether or not one has a spiritual or atheist agenda. Seventh, Taylor seems to forget his own word usage and rhetoric when he lambasts me for employing the word rogue, when he writes, "Even Lane's use of term rogue is telling. These phenomena are only rogue from the standpoint of materialism. They are only rogue because they contravene the assumptions of materialism." Lane's use of this term shows that he has already adopted materialism as his default metaphysical position and classifies phenomena according to whether they are acceptable in terms of its assumptions. Taylor neglects to remember that he, not me, was the one who first used such a descriptive term in his previous essay, when he wrote, "On the one hand, there are a wide range of anomalous phenomena that it cannot account for, from psychic phenomena to near-death experiences and spiritual experiences. These are rogue phenomena that have to be denied or explained away simply because they don't fit into the paradigm of materialism, in the same way that the existence of fossils don't fit into the paradigm of fundamentalist religion. I therefore used the term rogue in my follow-up essay exactly because it was a term that Taylor himself employed. Now, ironically, I am being called on the carpet for the term as if I were somehow intimately agreeing with it and thereby siding with a materialism-only stance. This is not only a bit ridiculous, it is disingenuous on Taylor's part. Let me state it very simply once again, since it bears repeating. My default position, in contradistinction with Taylor's misreading, is not one of metaphysical materialism. I don't hold such a view, since that assumes far too much. No. Rather, I have a practical bent which argues that we should fully explore and exhaust physical explanations first when attempting to explain the world at large. Does this by extension mean that only physical things and physical explanations exist? Not in the least, but it does show a pathway where we can better understand how certain phenomena like waves and like stars behave the way they do. I have already confessed my deepest metaphysic in a series of books and articles, and it is one, I suspect, I share with many others. What is that? I don't know much. And in that unknowingness, I like to see if I can possibly understand a bit more about myself and the universe, given the short duration we have on this planet. In this regard, I feel a kinship with Socrates, Lao Tzu, and Nicholas of Cusa, who each professed to a radical unknowingness, and how this, in turn, led them to a free and open inquiry of reality. Hence, it is for this very reason that I think we are better served by letting science look to physics and chemistry and biology first. Not because they are the only worthy disciplines, but because they can, by their very scrutiny, clear away the unnecessary shrubs of magical thinking by closely scrutinizing what can and cannot be known about the cosmos that surrounds us. Eighth, I find it rich with irony that Steve Taylor will cite Christoph Koch's work on consciousness because he has, claims Taylor, moved away from reductionist physicalist explanations. Actually, Koch confesses that he is a romantic reductionist, and even titled his autobiography with that same moniker, explaining in an interview that, "I'm a reductionist because I do what scientists do. I take a complex phenomenon and try to pull it apart and reduce it to something at a lower level." Koch is currently the president and chief scientific officer of the Allen Institute for Brain Science in Seattle. The main aim of this organization is explained in their vision statement. Understanding what makes us human is no small task. We are beginning with 3 primary areas of focus: deciphering how information is coded and processed in the brain, unraveling the codes within cells that govern their identity and function, and characterizing and cataloging the wide variety of cells that constitute the brain. I applaud these efforts since I think they will unravel much of the mystery behind why consciousness arises within, but not apparently without, neural complexity. On this front, Koch has aligned himself with Giulio Tononi and his theory of PHI, or integrated information theory. But this alignment doesn't argue for a soul or a spirit divorced from matter, but rather suggests certain forms of complexity in matter give a rise to different levels of consciousness. As Koch elaborates, so you want a brain-based test that tells you if this person is capable of some experience. People have developed that based on this integrated information series. That's big progress. The current state of my brain influences what happens in my brain the next second, and the past state of my brain influences what my brain does right now. Any system that has this cause-effect power upon itself is conscious. It derives from a mathematical measure. It could be a number that's 0, which means a system with no cause-effect power upon itself. It's not conscious. Or you have systems that are phi, different from 0. The phi measures, in some sense, the maximum capacity of the system to experience something. The higher the number, the more conscious the system. When Koch worked with Crick, they realized at the very beginning of their collaboration that in order to study consciousness, they would need to start with something fundamental, but less complex. They chose visual awareness. In a joint paper on the subject, they elaborated why. How can one approach consciousness in a scientific manner? Consciousness takes many forms, but for an initial scientific attack, it usually pays to concentrate on the form that appears easiest to study. We chose visual consciousness rather than other forms because humans are very visual animals and our visual percepts are especially vivid and rich in information. In addition, the visual input is often highly structured, yet easy to control. The visual system has another advantage. There are many experiments that, for ethical reasons, cannot be done on humans, but can be done on animals. Fortunately, the visual system of primates appears fairly similar to our own, Tootle et al., 1996, and many experiments on vision have already been done on animals, such as the macaque monkey. Again, Crick and Koch realized it was a matter of focus, and because of this specific concentration, they succeeded in making much headway, just as V.S. Ramachandran did when working on visual perception, and why amputees may feel phantom pain in limbs that no longer exist. Ninth, Taylor wrongly alleges that because I utilized his own terminology, that it shows that he has already adopted materialism as his default metaphysical position and classifies phenomena according to whether they are acceptable in terms of its assumptions. This isn't so different from a religious person who classifies phenomena as good or evil according to whether they accord with their beliefs. Once again, Taylor confuses a preference for practical results with metaphysical assumptions, overlooking my simple argument that if one really wants to provide evidence for the paranormal that will withstand the onslaughts of reason, then we should make doubly certain not to settle for anything less than overwhelming evidence, lest we be naively duped into the process by charlatanism, especially in a field filled with quackery. Does my clarion call for patience and skepticism, therefore, mean that I believe that rationality is the only method for understanding the world? No. It suggests that I don't want to see us get hoodwinked into believing something without sufficient evidence. in our desire for the transcendental, we don't need to rush the proceedings, as if this higher truth is so fragile and tentative that it will disappear if we ask too many doubtful questions of it. There are a number of instructive examples I can cite here, but let me focus on one that I have mentioned before. Baba Fakir Chand was a well-regarded Shabd yoga master who had a plethora of out-of-body experiences and was the devotional object of thousands of satsangis throughout India. He recalls how when he was young and in search of God, he had a transformative, visionary experience where he saw his future guru, Maharishi Shiv Brat Lal, who provided Fakir with his home address. Fakir was wonderstruck by this mystical encounter and began writing letters each month to the guru and the address he saw in his vision. 10 months later, he discovered that his vision was correct and that his eventual guru had received those letters. Eventually, Shiv Brat Lal responded, telling Fakir to personally visit him. Now, on the surface, this seems like an unassailable illustration of psychic power, telepathy or precognition or whatever label one wishes to enjoin, since Fakir apparently had no foreknowledge about the guru or his residence. Yet, decades later, when Fakir realized that religious visions were projections of one's own mind and were not generated by the religious figure who was objectified, then he started to wonder how and why he saw Shiv Brat Lal when he did, and, more pointedly, why he envisioned the correct address for him. Because Fakir allowed himself to doubt the psychic nature of his experience, he looked for more physicalist and rational explanations for his extraordinary vision, and to Fakir's chagrin, he found out that before he had his mystical experience, it was very likely that he had come upon one of Shiv Brat Lal's many publications, which were widely distributed in Hindi and Urdu at the time. In some of those pieces, Shiv Brat Lal's address is listed. Now, this doesn't explain away Fakir's vision, but only provides much more nuanced information to better understand how such a numinous encounter could possibly occur without resorting to something transrational. Therefore, it is vitally important, I would suggest, not to succumb to metaphysical theorizing too early if we have not yet done the necessary and hard work of thinking of alternate hypotheses which are grounded in what has already been established. 10th. Steve Taylor raises a question that I think is very easy to answer. He queries, but when do we get the go-ahead to apply different metaphysical approaches? At what point do we decide that materialism doesn't fit the bill? Anyone right now is quite free to apply whatever metaphysical approaches they wish, and they are also free to decide that materialism is insufficient. But herein lies the rub. What kind of evidence does one proffer to hold such a position? As Laplace argued long ago, and which Carl Sagan later modified, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary proof. The scientific community would welcome such amazing news. Bring it on. Who or what is holding anyone back? Particularly now, when there are open channels of information available worldwide via the Internet and the World Wide Web. But don't expect seasoned skeptics to rush where fools fear to tread, if what is proffered is less than convincing. Also, we should never be discouraged simply because critics demand more and more evidence for a given paranormal claim, since that will only help garner more information, not less, which can, over time, serve as a solid foundation for what was once regarded as pseudoscientific claptrap. 11th. Steve Taylor reveals a certain impatience when it comes to understanding consciousness and NDEs, which I find surprising, particularly given how both fields of study are so new. Writes Taylor, "It is time to admit failure and try different approaches. Surely, after decades after attempting and failing to explain psi phenomena as fraud and to explain near-death experiences in neurological terms, it is time to adopt other perspectives." There is much to unpack here in Taylor's rhetoric, but let me start with the most obvious. There has been massive fraud in those who claim to have psychic powers, and we should be thankful that trained magicians, independent scholars, and sharp-minded skeptics have exposed these charlatans trying to pass off their cheap parlor tricks for the real deal. So, on this front, we must be uber-vigilant not to be taken in by con artists who get cleverer each year in deceiving us with their tricks. Furthermore, the scientific study of consciousness and near-death experiences is a relatively new endeavor, especially given that our technological tools for studying the brain and all its complexity are still in their infancy and are quite crude compared to what they will be in the decades to come. Lambasting neuroscience for not yet fully resolving the mystery of consciousness is akin to critiquing Kepler for not being able to precisely explain the orbit of Mercury. Astronomy back then, like neuroscience today, was in its beginning stages. It takes time for any science to mature and develop more exacting theories that can make predictions that will withstand scrutiny. The brain and its 86 million neurons are the most complex structure in the known universe, as of yet found. And therefore, is it really that surprising that it will take some time to unravel all its subtle interactions? Lest we forget, it is only called promissory materialism because it has in the past, via astronomy, physics, chemistry, and biology, been able to deliver on so many promises in a stupendous way, from unraveling the genome to mapping the known universe. Do we castigate physics today because there are still things like dark matter and dark energy that physicists don't fully comprehend? No. We realize that it will take further research and investigation. Science is a patient endeavor, even if we humans are not. There is no need to go metaphysical when we haven't even touched the surface of what can be known physically. 12th. Steve Taylor mistakenly criticizes my approach as scientism when he writes, "The point here is that the metaphysical interpretation of my mother's predicament is completely distinct to science as an enterprise. Lane continually and misguidedly uses science as a justification for scientism. His faith in materialism is literally a faith, a quasi-religious attachment to a particular metaphysical framework. As John Eccles noted, promissory materialism is an irrational superstition, simply a religious belief held by dogmatic materialists, who often confuse their religion with their science." Nowhere have I advocated scientism. Championing a physics-first approach along the lines of Edward O. Wilson's consilience doesn't mean that only physical things exist or that I have blind faith in materialism. Rather, it is a practical methodology whereby one attempts to explain any given phenomena by what is known physically about it. By concentrating on that first and exhausting its varied permutations, we will forego the danger of prematurely mistaking a physical event for a spiritual one. Just as when I go to the dentist when I have pain in my wisdom tooth, he looks at my mouth and not my soul. This doesn't discount spirit as such, as if looking merely at root canals can somehow discount metaphysical possibilities, but highlights, once again, the simplicity of my whole thesis. It's a matter of focus. This isn't scientism, and it isn't anti-spirituality. It's called being practical. I realize that for many it comes as a surprise when they learn that I have been a lifelong Sharpt yoga meditator, been to India on numerous research projects studying yogis and mystics, and have a great fondness for Advaita Vedanta philosophy. I love the interior quest, and I, along with Sam Harris and others, believe it is vitally important. But let's not confuse domains in our rush to proselytize for the superluminal. As I wrote to J.K. earlier today responding to my article Understanding Matter, I sense that too often we rush away from physicalist explanations when we think something is rogue or paranormal, but if given more time and more patient inquiry, we discover, perhaps to our chagrin, that there was indeed a rational, even mundane reason behind such a weird phenomenon. This prioritizing should not be construed as preemption, but as a positive aspect of skepsis or a more thorough investigation. In the past, when we didn't understand the physics or chemistry of an event, we tended to inflate towards metaphysical or spiritual causations. Now, of course, we are free to do so even now, but I suspect if we do such, we run the very real risk of prematurely buying into something as trans-rational, when in fact it is anything but. Yet, this scientific centering doesn't have to preclude other approaches as well. Just that we will gather more, not less, evidence for something genuinely supernatural by exhausting the physicalist explanations first. And, in contrast with what Steve Taylor may suspect, I wrote the following to Greg Stogsdill. I like your idea that the two inquiries, spiritual and physical, don't have to be mutually exclusive. As a lifelong meditator and an avid reader of Ramana Maharshi and other Indian Advaita Vedanta philosophers, I do understand and appreciate the consciousness-first idea. I just worry that we can confuse domains and end up in a New Age la-la land. However, there are those scientists who are attempting to make the consciousness-first idea verifiable and open to falsification, particularly with a mathematical bent. Finally, I find it a bit bewildering that Steve Taylor would favor a spirit-matter dualism when he writes, "In physicalist terms, we would presume simply that damage to my mother's brain has affected her mental functioning, in the same way that damage to a computer affects its functioning. But from pan-spiritist terms, we could say that because of her neurological damage, the brain's role as a transmitter of consciousness has been affected, in the same way that damage to radio stops its transmitting. You might even say that because of the damage to her brain, it is no longer able to act as a canalizer of consciousness, so that she is no longer conscious, but simply a collection of old mental habits and behavioral traits." There are so many unanswered questions when positing the consciousness as transmitter and brain as receiver hypothesis, not the least of which is why material complexity is necessary for channeling self-reflective awareness. In addition, the transmitter-receiver idea doesn't solve the knotty question of where consciousness comes from, since now we have the added conundrum of trying to figure out exactly where the consciousness frequencies are being broadcast. In the ether, from an astral plane, from Bill and Ted's makeshift garage. Moreover, why is the subjective experience of awareness so dramatically altered by the hardware of the brain and by the biochemistry that enlivens it? Why is messing with the objective hardware so damaging to the personal sense of awareness, particularly if they are two distinct entities? I don't see why viewing the brain as a canalizer of consciousness is helpful in any progressive way to a scientific study of the subject at hand. Indeed, by postulating such an obvious dualism, we seem to have backtracked centuries and have resurrected René Descartes' bipolar philosophy. Perhaps we can get rid of this obfuscating bifurcation by seeing the complexity of matter in whatever form as a necessary prelude to the manifestation of awareness. This form of monism doesn't see matter and awareness as separate, but as two sides of the same physically complex coin. As Koch himself illuminates, GNW argues that consciousness arises from a particular type of information processing, familiar from the early days of artificial intelligence when specialized programs would access a small, shared repository of information. Whatever data were written onto this blackboard became available to a host of subsidiary processes, working memory, language, the planning module, and so on. According to GNW, consciousness emerges when incoming sensory information inscribed onto such a blackboard is broadcast globally to multiple cognitive systems, which process these data to speak, store, or call up a memory or execute an action. Because the blackboard has limited space, we can only be aware of a little information at any given instant. The network of neurons that broadcast these messages is hypothesized to be located in the frontal and parietal lobes. Once these sparse data are broadcast on this network and are globally available, the information becomes conscious. That is, the subject becomes aware of it. Whereas current machines do not yet rise to this level of cognitive sophistication, this is only a question of time. GNW posits that computers of the future will be conscious. Integrated Information Theory, IIT, developed by Tononi and his collaborators, including me, has a very different starting point: experience itself. Each experience has certain essential properties. It is intrinsic, existing only for the subject as its owner. It is structured, a yellow cab braking while a brown dog crosses the street, and it is specific, distinct from any other conscious experience, such as a particular frame in a movie. Furthermore, it is unified and definite. When you sit on a park bench on a warm, sunny day watching children play, the different parts of the experience, the breeze playing in your hair or the joy of hearing your toddler laugh, cannot be separated into parts without the experience ceasing to be what it is. Tononi postulates that any complex and interconnected mechanism whose structure encodes a set of cause and effect relationships will have these properties, and so will have some level of consciousness. It will feel like something from the inside. But if, like the cerebellum, the mechanism lacks integration and complexity, it will not be aware of anything. As IIT states it, consciousness is intrinsic causal power associated with complex mechanisms such as the human brain. IIT theory also derives from the complexity of the underlying interconnected structure a single non-negative number, the Greek letter phi, that quantifies this consciousness. If phi is 0, the system does not feel like anything to be itself. Conversely, the bigger this number, the more intrinsic causal power the system possesses, and the more conscious it is. The brain, which has enormous and highly specific connectivity, possesses very high phi, which implies a high level of consciousness. IIT explains a number of observations, such as why the cerebellum does not contribute to consciousness, and why the zap and zip meter works. The quantity the meter measures is a very crude approximation of phi. IIT also predicts that a sophisticated simulation of a human brain running on a digital computer cannot be conscious, even if it can speak in a manner indistinguishable from a human being. Just as simulating the massive gravitational attraction of a black hole does not actually deform space-time around the computer implementing the astrophysical code, programming for consciousness will never create a conscious computer. Consciousness cannot be computed. It must be built into the structure of the system. Two challenges lie ahead. One is to use the increasingly refined tools at our disposal to observe and probe the vast coalitions of highly heterogeneous neurons making up the brain to further delineate the neuronal footprints of consciousness. This effort will take decades, given the Byzantine complexity of the central nervous system. The other is to verify or falsify the two currently dominant theories, or, perhaps, to construct a better theory out of fragments of these two that will satisfactorily explain the central puzzle of our existence. How a 3-pound organ with the consistency of tofu exudes the feeling of life. Now, I would like to end my 150th article for Integral World on a note of reconciliation. As much as I disagree with Steve Taylor and others of his ilk, I want to encourage them in their efforts for challenging the status quo, since critical voices are needed from a variety of fields. Even when we are at loggerheads, our very differences can better illuminate what is needed for more integrated understanding of self-awareness. Personally speaking, I greatly appreciate those who have opinions different than my own, because they make me think anew about subjects close to my mind and heart. I tip my hat to Frank Visser for providing all of us with an invaluable forum to share our thoughts uncensored and without rancor. I have learned much from my colleagues who have taken the time to share their insights with me. I feel fortunate to have been able to add my 2 cents in his ongoing intellectual exchange, even if what I proffer is met with skepticism. Such is the learning process.